It shouldn't come as a surprise that we love Star Wars: The Clone Wars, and if you watch our content regularly, it's a safe bet that you probably do too. Once upon a time, when it was first airing, The Clone Wars was generally dismissed by a lot of Star Wars fans. That has since changed, and nowadays, The Clone Wars is pretty widely beloved, honoured as essential viewing for any serious Star Wars fan. It was even given a proper finale years after its initial cancellation, long after any hope that the show would be given the conclusion it deserved had faded. That finale, Victory and Death, aired 5 years ago this year, and in light of this, we figured it was about time we took another look at the show that's been such a source of inspiration and entertainment for us over the years. Today, we'll be re-examining Star Wars: The Clone Wars and looking at what it adds to the mythology of Star Wars.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
Star Wars: The Clone Wars was really ahead of its time. It wasn't the first Star Wars television series, an honor that belongs to the droids and Ewoks cartoons of the 80s, but it was Star Wars' first foray into television as its primary medium. Previous series had been firmly within the bounds of the expanded universe, side stories in the grand scheme of the Star Wars mythos. But The Clone Wars was meant to be Star Wars' next big thing after the prequel trilogy, the centerpiece of a new era of Star Wars mythmaking. George Lucas himself was heavily involved in the series, and this wasn't just out of interest in the project. In a sense, The Clone Wars was a test, meant to pave the way for what Lucas envisioned as the next big chapter of the Star Wars saga, Star Wars Underworld, a high-budget, live-action television series meant to bridge the gap between the prequel and original trilogies. Of course, before all that got off the ground, Disney bought Lucasfilm. Underworld got canned, and The Clone Wars was cancelled. Star Wars' next big project ended up not being a series, but a new array of films, the sequel trilogy, as well as a few spin-off movies. It was only as that project started to wind down that Star Wars finally ventured into the realm of live-action television. Now, Star Wars has made the shift that George Lucas had always intended. Its big projects for the past few years have all been television series following the lead of the wildly successful first season of The Mandalorian. It's somewhat fitting that it was during this pivot to Star Wars being primarily on TV that The Clone Wars, which had been all but ignored by Lucasfilm since it was cancelled in the wake of the Disney buyout, got its long-awaited conclusion. After all, it had laid the foundation for The Mandalorian and the bevy of new Star Wars series we've gotten ever since. But while The Clone Wars laid the groundwork for all the Star Wars series that have come since, from Rebels to The Mandalorian, it's still unique in one key respect. While most of the long-running Star Wars series tell the stories of a consistent cast of main characters, The Clone Wars doesn't. It doesn't even have a main character. Sure, it's got plenty of major characters, but none of them are the main focus of the show. They move in and out of its stories, sometimes disappearing for many episodes in a row. The Clone Wars is an anthology, and while it isn't unique in that respect, it's unique among Star Wars series in how it uses that anthology format to build a single cohesive narrative. It maintains this central through line despite not having a set of constant main characters or even without having a central plot. Sure, there are several long plot threads that stretch out over several seasons, but they're all mostly distinct from each other with a minimal overlap, and the seasons are packed with smaller arcs that tell more self-contained stories. The show even tells a lot of its stories out of chronological order. This might sound like a recipe for a disjointed mess, but despite the chaotic way in which the show tells its story, The Clone Wars still has a center. Every story arc in the show gives you a piece of a much grander story, the story of the Clone Wars. The conflict itself is the show's main character. Its story told through the smaller stories of dozens of major and supporting characters whose experiences and development over the course of their respective story arcs come together to paint a complete, nuanced picture of the war that changed everything. It's a story that's far too big to be conveyed through just one set of main characters, so the Clone Wars doesn't try to approach it that way. Rather, it approaches it from many wildly different perspectives, showing the war from all sides, from the battles on the front lines to the politics fueling them at home, from the stories of clone troopers and Jedi to those of ordinary citizens and the Separatists. In doing so, it allows the audience to understand the Clone Wars in a way that they wouldn't have been able to had the story been told in any other manner. But what does Star Wars: The Clone Wars, when considered as a whole, actually say about the Clone Wars? Well, that's what we're here to talk about, because the Clone Wars doesn't just paint a picture, it has messages to convey as well. That's obvious to anyone who's seen the show. Every episode states its moral in the opening credits, after all. But just like the individual story threads of the Clone Wars come together to tell the story of war, the different messages and themes of the series' episodes all contribute to a few big lessons the show tries to teach its audience. To discuss those, however, we need to go back and take a look at the different plot threads that make up the show and what each one of them adds to the story of the Clone Wars. We're going to at least touch on almost every single episode of the show, but not individually and not in order. Rather, we're going to be grouping them together based on the major storylines they contribute to, and it's those overarching narratives that we're going to be focusing on. We're going to start where the series itself begins, or at least the Clone Wars film, on the front lines. Star Wars: The Clone Wars spends a fair bit of time showing us the major battles of the Clone Wars, which is what you'd expect for a show of that name. While it doesn't often delve too deeply into the context of these grand battles, many of the show's most beloved arcs go into detail about the dynamics of some of the war's most crucial conflicts, while other arcs are set against the backdrop of these large battles. The Clone Wars doesn't spend the whole series on the front lines. In fact, most of the series is spent on smaller battlefields or off the battlefield altogether. While this serves to reinforce the impact of these major battles and the sense of scale that comes with them, it goes to show that the Clone Wars, both the series and the conflict itself, isn't all about grand battles. But they're nonetheless the most visible part of the conflict, and you've got to start somewhere. The Clone Wars opens with the Battle of Christosis, and while the series' opening film isn't focused on the front lines for the most part, the Christosis introduction nonetheless establishes how the series initially frames the war. We're thrown into an epic battle between the forces of the Republic and those of the Separatists. On one side, we have our heroes, initially 2 and later 3 brave Jedi generals, and the small but fierce legion of clones they lead into battle. On the other, we have the endless droid armies of the Separatists, which are marched into the fray like cannon fodder on the orders of a brusque and seemingly uncaring alien general. The battle is set on a strange and eye-catching alien world, but despite the battle taking place in the middle of a city, there are no civilians in sight, and the Christosians are never even mentioned. The Separatists' armies have an advantage in numbers, but our Republic heroes are able to outwit them in the end, winning the battle and preventing the Separatists from taking Christosis. The series later establishes the context of this battle in the episodes The Hidden Enemy and Cat and Mouse, but for the purposes of the film, this context is unnecessary. The viewer is thrust into the situation, and despite having no real reason to believe this is the case, the show leads them into the assumption that the Republic is fighting to liberate this planet from the CIS. The Republic and its defenders are implicitly assumed to be the good guys, fighting against an expansionist separatist enemy. This is how the series sets up the Clone Wars as a whole, or at least it's the narrative the show expects the viewer to come into the show with. It starts with the simple premise of Republic good, Separatist bad, devoid of all other context. This is, of course, how many of our protagonists see the Clone Wars. The clones, and even most of the Jedi at least, seem to start from this perspective. The show entertains this narrative for a while too. Throughout the first 2 seasons, the Republic is almost always on the right side of things, and the series arcs that focus on the front lines of the war rarely question this premise. Throughout Season 1, the show's big battle arcs all take effort to paint the Separatists as evil. General Grievous targets medical transports in the Malevolence arc and kills his collaborators in Duel of the Droids, while lesser Separatist villains like Lock Durd and Nuvo Vindi test cruel incendiary weapons against peaceful villagers and create bioweapons with the express intent of causing a galactic pandemic. Separatist agents like Gar Nacht and Captain Argus are painted as honorless snakes, caring about personal profit and nothing else. In the first season's main frontline arc, which concerns the Battle of Ryloth, Republic forces are explicitly portrayed as the liberators of a people enslaved by the Separatist-aligned Techno-Union, which uses them as human shields, carpet bombs their settlements, and loots all their cultural treasures. Things start getting less black and white in seasons 2 and 3. The major battles on Felucia, Geonosis, Malastare, Seleucami, and Camino are all purely strategic in nature, with no real moral characterization for either side. But even then, the show still pushes you to root for the Republic, which it continues to present as the right side in this war. However, slowly but surely, this narrative starts to be undermined by the other plot threads of Star Wars: The Clone Wars, which start adding nuance to the conflict as far back as the first film, which introduces audiences to Ahsoka Tano. Ahsoka is perhaps the most important of the Clone Wars' original characters. The film that opens the series is mostly about introducing her to audiences and establishing her relationship with Anakin Skywalker, her new master. She appears pretty regularly throughout the series. She's not in every episode, but she's in a lot of them, and her character serves a vital purpose in the show. In the beginning, at least, she's an outsider, a newcomer to the Clone Wars, and in that, she acts as a point of view character for the audience. As she learns more about the dynamics of the war, the audience does as well, and from her perspective, we start to see the first few holes in that simple narrative of the war that we were just talking about. For one, Ahsoka is a child. She acts like it through the first 2 seasons as well, to the ire of some viewers, though she grows up as the series goes on. From her first appearance, the show even goes out of its way to emphasize just how young she is. In the film, Anakin questions whether she's even old enough to be a Padawan. This is the show's first indication that the morality of the war isn't all that clear-cut. Sure, Ahsoka is a Jedi, but she's also very obviously a child, and yet she's not only thrust onto the battlefields of the Clone Wars, but she's made an officer in the Grand Army of the Republic, made responsible for the lives of others despite being just 14 years old. She wouldn't even be old enough to drive in the real world, but by Republic military standards, she's not only old enough to fly starfighters into battle, but to command a whole squadron of career pilots. The show itself ignores this, and it softens the blow with how readily Ahsoka adapts to war. After all, she's not just a child, she's a Jedi, and that makes her a cut above ordinary beings. She doesn't seem bothered by her situation at all. On the contrary, she's eager to get involved in the fight, and though she's clearly presented as naive and headstrong at first, she's also clearly quite capable. She performs better on the battlefields of the Clone Wars than most adults could imagine themselves doing, so the show gets the viewer to just accept Ahsoka's place in the war, at least at first. Throughout most of the season, Ahsoka doesn't develop all that much. She learns some lessons here and there, sure. R3, S6 in Duel of the Droids and Captain Argus in Cloak of Darkness both teach her painful lessons about being too trusting, while the episode Jedi Crash sees her learn responsibility as she tries to cope when Anakin is severely injured. But her character remains largely unchanged until the end of the season, when, in the episode Storm over Ryloth, she finally has to confront the reality of war. Ahsoka goes into Storm of Ryloth with the same attitude that she's displayed all season. She's still a novice commander, eager and overconfident, both stubborn in the face of authority and naive about the nature of the war. For most of the series up to this point, these have mostly just been quirks of her character, but in this episode, they get her into trouble. At the start of the episode, She leads a squadron of clone pilots in an attempt to break the separatist blockade of Ryloth, only for her forces to be outmaneuvered. She is ordered to retreat, but she defies her orders and leads her men straight into the Hornet's nest. This is something that she's done before and that Anakin has done as well. She did pretty much the same thing at the start of the season in Shadow of Malevolence and was rewarded for it, as her defiance led to the rescue of Plo Koon. But this time, she not only risks her own life, but the lives of the men under her command, the clone pilots that she's become close friends with, and it gets all of them killed. Ahsoka is ultimately forced to retreat anyway, but virtually her entire squadron is wiped out before she makes it back to the Resolute. In the wake of this, Ahsoka is forced to contend with the reality of war and the horror of people she cares about dying because of the decisions she makes. It crushes her, and in the process, it forces the audience to really consider Ahsoka's place in all of this. Sure, Ahsoka is a Jedi, but she's still a kid, and she's clearly not ready for the responsibilities of command. The cruelty of the situation is unavoidable, and it shows us a new side of the Clone Wars, the unfairness of it for those involved, and the loss that's inherent to war of any sort. In Storm over Ryloth, Anakin allows Ahsoka to rebuild her self-confidence by having her plan the Republic's next attempt at breaking the Separatist blockade. With the support of Admiral Yularen and Captain Rex, Ahsoka is able to work out a plan which ultimately proves successful, leading to a Republic victory in the naval battle over Ryloth. Ahsoka ultimately leaves the episode with her confidence rebuilt and with better command skills. She also leaves the episode as a more developed character. Going into the initial assault, Ahsoka understood the Clone Wars in an idealized, impersonal, abstract way. The reality of the conflict hadn't quite hit home for her. She knows that people die in war, but she doesn't yet understand that people die in war. The death tolls for any given battle are just a statistic until you know some of the names on the casualty list. Ahsoka knew and was friends with the pilots of Blue Squadron, particularly Axe, and when almost all of them, Axe included, die in combat, then the casualties of war suddenly mean something to her. The subsequent realization that the deaths of her pilots were her fault makes this hit even harder. All this has a similar effect on the viewer. By this point in the show, we're used to seeing the clones get shot or V-19s get blown up. But give those clones names and personalities, and suddenly it means a whole lot more, especially when, as in this episode, those deaths are ultimately in vain. Unlike in other episodes, the clone pilots who died in Storm over Ryloth didn't die for a purpose. Their deaths were unnecessary and contributed nothing to the eventual Republic victory. They died for nothing. Ahsoka has a similar experience in the premiere of Season 2, when her overconfidence and tunnel vision lead to the deaths of a whole unit of Republic ground troops on Felucia. This time, there's no eventual victory to make her feel better about the whole thing, and she has to live with the fact that she just led a bunch of her men to their deaths. As a result of these hard-learned lessons, Ahsoka begins to change over the course of the second season. She starts to become a bit less brash, less cheery and eager to fight, and a bit more level-headed. She starts to grow up. As a result, she responds better to crises in the second season episodes Brain Invaders, Bounty Hunters, and Lethal Trackdown than the Ahsoka of Season 1 would have, approaching the crises of these episodes with more experience, calm, and focus. But in our opinion, the Season 2 episode that best showcases Ahsoka's development is the often neglected standalone episode Lightsaber Lost, which sees Ahsoka work with the elderly Jedi Master Terra Senube to find her lightsaber after it's stolen in the Coruscant Underworld. The basic lesson of this episode is glaringly obvious. If you slow down and pay attention instead of rushing into things, you'll have an easier time solving your problems. It's equally obvious that this is a lesson Ahsoka desperately needs, as she spends most of the episode going about things much too fast to notice important details, something that's partly a product of her anxiety over the situation, but also a pre-existing character flaw of hers. In fact, we'd say it's her defining character flaw, which most of her other flaws stem from. From the get-go, Ahsoka's hastiness makes her reckless and overconfident, and she rushes into fights to disastrous effect time and time again. She learns lessons from these incidents, sure, but it's only in Lightsaber Lost that she's forced to confront the source of these mistakes, thanks to the influence of a slow old man and a thief who's even faster and hastier than she is. It's also worth noting that Ahsoka's hastiness was a character flaw that neither Anakin nor Obi-Wan ever tried to correct. For Anakin, this was a lesson he'd never learned, so he couldn't exactly teach it, but not even Obi-Wan bothers to try to get her to slow down, and this is largely a product of the war. In a battlefield situation, speed is of the essence, and slowing down can get you killed. This is likely why Anakin and Obi-Wan never seem to treat her hastiness as a problem. They know that, in war, being too fast is usually better than being too slow, and so they try to guide Ahsoka into taking more calculated risks instead of just slowing down. In Lightsaber Lost, however, Ahsoka is trying to apply that approach off the battlefield where it doesn't work as well. In this, we see that Ahsoka, having been raised on the battlefield, has had consequences. War is all she knows now. What's more, it's a look into how the war has twisted the Jedi Order, something we'll touch on more in a bit. Tera Sinube is teaching Ahsoka lessons that are fundamental to the Jedi way, which any Jedi of a previous generation would have learned early in their apprenticeship, but in the chaos of the Clone Wars, such teachings are being forgotten. For new Padawans, learning the Jedi way has come second to learning the way of war. But things aren't all bleak. Ahsoka is ultimately able to learn Sinube's lesson, and at the end of the episode, she's even shown teaching it to younglings in the temple. This, perhaps, more than anything else, is a demonstration of her growing maturity and of how Ahsoka is slowly but surely moving out from under Anakin's shadow, becoming her own person. She isn't just a learner anymore, but someone who can make valuable contributions on her own and teach the next generation as well. She's grown up, and in the episodes that follow, we begin to really see her shine. Lightsaber Lost is the end of an arc for Ahsoka. Her character journey begins a dramatic shift after this episode. By season 3, she's no longer a novice learning the horrors of war and confronting basic character flaws, but an experienced Jedi commander expanding her horizons and learning new perspectives. Throughout season 3, we see her shoulder increasingly more responsibility. In the 3rd season, she saves Padme from an assassination attempt, contends with the lessons of Mortis, faces the horrors of the Citadel, and in the finale is forced to fight to survive when taken prisoner and hunted for sport by Trandoshan slavers. In each of these instances, Ahsoka is not struggling to overcome basic flaws anymore. Rather, she's confronting new and ever more horrifying obstacles, learning to overcome them and maturing further as she does so. She becomes more independent and capable, especially in the wake of the season 3 finale, in which she has to apply everything she's learned so far to survive in the face of unimaginable cruelty and dismal odds. That trend continues through the next 2 seasons. In season 4, Ahsoka finds herself surviving and making hard calls on her own increasingly often, and in season 5, there are 2 entire arcs that revolve around her taking leadership roles and continuing to move out of Anakin's shadow. In season 5's Onderon arc, Ahsoka undertakes a solo mission on behalf of the Republic, helping to lead a coup against a separatist-backed government. By this point, Ahsoka has long since ceased to be the learner. While she still has personal challenges to overcome on Onderon, for the most part, she's the one leading the rebels and passing on what she's learned throughout the show to them. The student has become the master, something that's made even clearer in the next arc, in which Ahsoka acts as the guardian and teacher of a group of Jedi younglings who get tangled up with pirates and the armies of General Grievous. This trend reaches its conclusion at the start of the 5th season's final arc, in which Ahsoka saves Anakin's life during a battle on Cato Nemoidia. This sequence shows pretty clearly that Ahsoka's at least very close to having become Anakin's equal, and close to having earned the title of Jedi Knight. As Ahsoka matures, develops her skills, and creeps ever closer to knighthood, however, something else begins to shift about her character. Her outlook on the galaxy and the war. At the beginning of her character arc, Ahsoka embodied the naive viewpoint of the Clone Wars we talked about earlier, seeing the conflict as a heroic battle fought in defense of a noble republic which was under threat from ruthless, sinister separatist forces. But beginning in Season 3, Ahsoka is forced to reconsider elements of this worldview. The heroic veneer of the war quickly vanishes as Ahsoka loses ever more of her friends in battle after battle. And the nobility of the Republic's fights comes into question too. In the episode Heroes on Both Sides, she learns that the people behind the separatist movement aren't all that bad, and all throughout the later seasons of the show, she sees the damage the Clone Wars have inflicted on the galaxy at large, the devastation the conflict causes even neutral worlds, and the criminal organizations that thrive in the chaos, all of which we'll discuss in a bit more depth later. Ahsoka doesn't exactly become disillusioned, not yet at any rate. She's still ardently on the side of the Republic, as shown in the Onderon arc, but it becomes evident to her that the war is far more complex than she initially thought it was, and that it affects far more than the belligerents. Fighting in the war becomes a struggle for her, but she sees through side missions that it's even more of a struggle for the people caught in the crossfire, who the Republic and even the Jedi ignore. In this time of war, justice is increasingly hard to find in the galaxy as the Jedi are sent off to the battlefield instead of to help the people who need them. This comes to a head in the final arc of Season 5 when Ahsoka experiences the injustice the war has inflicted upon the galaxy firsthand. That arc sees her framed for murders she didn't commit, and instead of coming to her defense, the Jedi Order surrenders her to the prosecution. Part of this was that she was just framed well, but part of it is political in nature. As the Clone Wars seep into everything, the Jedi Order has become an apparatus of the Republic military, beholden to the Republic's demands. Thus, the Jedi are forced to extradite her so that she can face a Republic military tribunal instead of trying her themselves. The Jedi clearly aren't happy with this, but they go along with it. Ahsoka understands this as a betrayal, but the reality is even more grim. The Jedi have been left with little choice, even if they didn't believe the evidence suggested she was guilty. The war has robbed the Jedi of the ability to ensure justice in the galaxy, the thing the Jedi Order supposedly exists to do. Ahsoka is let off at the last minute thanks to the help of Anakin, but she's left shaken and deeply disillusioned from the experience, not least because the real murderer and the person who tried to frame her turned out to have been a former close friend of hers, fellow Jedi Barriss Offee. This, combined with the half-hearted apology the Council gives her, pushes Ahsoka to refuse the Council's offer to return to the Order as a full Jedi Knight. Instead, she chooses to walk away from the Jedi and the war altogether. Her experience being framed for murder brought her face to face with the fact that neither the Republic nor the Jedi stand for justice anymore. The Republic has chosen not to, while the Jedi have been forced to go along, subsumed into the Republic as just another tool of war. This, together with all the other injustices caused by the war, convinces Ahsoka that she doesn't want to be part of it anymore. This isn't the end of Ahsoka's character arc, but it's where we'll leave off with it for now. Instead, we'll shift gears and talk about the other story thread that's particularly prominent in the Season 5 finale, how the Clone Wars affected the Jedi. At several points in the Clone Wars, Jedi characters repeat a line that's said in the films as well, that the Jedi are keepers of the peace, not soldiers. And yet, in the Clone Wars, they serve as generals, to the eventual near exclusion of their other duties. This was not by choice. Expanded universe materials established that the Jedi were drafted by executive order, and the Clone Wars presents nothing to dispute this. What's more, at several points, it shows how the Republic forces the Order to go along with its dictates, as seen most clearly throughout the Season 5 finale arc, in which Admiral Tarkin repeatedly interferes in Jedi affairs with the backing of the Republic, which has recently stripped the Order of some of its authority over its own personnel. But the Jedi are still complicit in their assimilation into the Republic war machine. As we've already discussed, throughout the show, we see examples of the Jedi putting their primary duties and even their core teachings aside in favor of overseeing the war effort. Season 5's Youngling arc shows us that even the training of the youngest Jedi has been impacted, as in these chaotic times, the Order can't even send its initiates to Ilum for training without getting them caught up in the tides of war. Ahsoka and other young Jedi being raised on the battlefield is just one side of how the war has begun to dilute the Jedi teachings too. Throughout the series, we see Jedi grow increasingly comfortable with violence, slicing through droids without a second thought, and even butchering organics on some occasions, though to be fair, it's mostly Anakin doing that. Over the course of the show's first 4 seasons, the Jedi Order's role in the Clone Wars is rarely questioned directly, and the same is true for how the war has distracted them from their other duties. Much like with Ahsoka being a child soldier, we see the ramifications of the Jedi being caught up in the war, from how it's shaped the way they handle matters to the criminal elements that have thrived while the Jedi are busy on the battlefield, but the show rarely addresses the issue head-on for most of its run. When it does, it's through characters like Tiwat Ka, a pacifist lurman who, in the Season 1 episode Defenders of Peace, criticizes the Jedi for fighting in the war, but ultimately has to rely on the Jedi to save his village, undermining his argument. The arguments posed by Ka and characters like him aren't meant to be seriously considered by the audience. They're intended as straw men for the protagonists to knock over, nothing more. But the audience sees the truth all the same. We see how the Jedi have become almost exclusively concerned with their role in the Clone Wars at the expense of even their own students. They've committed everything to the conflict, and slowly, the Jedi Order is being redefined by the war, made into little more than the Republic's military elite. Now and again, Jedi get a break to do more usual Jedi stuff, but these breaks are uncommon and they're ultimately insufficient. The Jedi's involvement in the war has left a void in the galaxy, and the innocent suffer for it. It's all there, but for a while, it isn't really touched on directly. That changes in Season 5, however, when the finale arc calls out the Order directly for the extent to which the Clone Wars have consumed them. This trend continues in the last arc of Season 6, in which Yoda is forced to confront, among other things, the same truth. This arc starts with the Jedi making a fairly un-Jedi-like decision. When Yoda starts hearing the voice of Qui-Gon Jinn, the Council investigates a little through the Force, but they stop halfway, distracted by other matters, and essentially conclude that Yoda has just finally gone senile. While we're being a bit flippant here, the fact remains that the Jedi Council, a body meant to meditate on the Force in pursuit of greater truths, starts this arc off by deciding that they have better things to do than meditate on the Force in pursuit of greater truths, which isn't a terribly good sign. It bothers Yoda enough that he decides to go off on his own to investigate things, and over the course of his quest, he experiences a series of revelations. On Dagobah, Qui-Gon confronts Yoda with the knowledge that the Jedi Order will soon be destroyed, and more importantly, that it has already started dying. This is something we've seen all throughout the show, as the Clone Wars have reduced Jedi to mere warriors, causing the Order as a whole to lose focus and become caught up in the affairs of the Republic. We've been watching this phenomenon the whole time, and through Yoda, the show forces us to see that for what it really is: the death of the Jedi Order. This lesson is reinforced at Yoda's next stop on his quest, the Wellspring of the Force, where Yoda is also faced with a vision of a world in which the Clone Wars never happened. A world in which the Jedi Order is as it once was, uncorrupted by the conflict. This makes clear that the Jedi Order's issues stem from the war and how the Jedi have allowed themselves to get caught up in it. The way this vision ends also shows that it's too late for the Order to return to what it once was. The peace Yoda sees is ultimately an illusion, lost forever, and there's no avoiding the destruction that is to come now. Yoda's final vision on Korriban shows him the only way out for the Jedi. In this vision, he fights an illusory battle with Darth Sidious alongside Darth Skywalker, which comes to a point at which Yoda has a choice. He can abandon Anakin to keep up the fight, or he can sacrifice himself to save Anakin. The former choice lays bare the nature of the problems afflicting the Jedi. Like Yoda almost does in his vision, the Jedi have gotten so fixated on what they understand as their battle against the Sith, which is to say the Clone Wars, that they've forgotten the most important calling of the Jedi, which is to sacrifice themselves to protect those who cannot protect themselves. In the Clone Wars, the Jedi have started doing the opposite, sacrificing the innocent on the altar of the war effort, as the series shows us time and time again. For there to be any hope for the future, the Jedi must make the choice Yoda ultimately makes, to sacrifice themselves for the sake of the future. We see the consequences of this lesson in Revenge of the Sith, when, instead of fighting to the death against Darth Sidious, Yoda chooses to retreat at the end of his battle with the Dark Lord. Recognizing that he cannot destroy Sidious on his own, he goes into exile and dedicates himself to the protection and eventually the training of the next generation of Skywalkers. The surviving Jedi must admit defeat and accept the Order's destruction in order to be able to ensure the eventual triumph of the light and the fulfillment of the prophecy of the Chosen One. Speaking of the Chosen One, let's talk about Anakin Skywalker. Anakin's place in the Clone Wars is interesting, since his character is downgraded from being the focus of the story, as it was in the prequels, to one of many major recurring characters. Early in the series' development, it was an open question whether he would even be in the show at all, but he was ultimately included as one of the show's leading protagonists, and the show ultimately spends parts of several arcs retroactively developing his character. The Clone Wars' depiction of Anakin Skywalker lines up pretty neatly with the Anakin we see in Revenge of the Sith, rather than trying to strike a balance between the depictions of his character in Revenge of the Sith and Attack of the Clones. At the start of the series, Anakin is already a Jedi Knight, something that causes innumerable problems for the existing Legends timeline, and the angst that defines his character in Attack of the Clones is pretty much entirely gone. Clearly, Anakin has done a lot of growing up in the first few months of the war, to the point where he's deemed ready to take on a Padawan of his own. Of course, having Anakin already line up pretty much exactly with his Revenge of the Sith characterization meant the Clone Wars couldn't take the easy way out for developing his character, which would have meant showing his journey toward knighthood and how he developed into the man we see in the final prequel. The original Clone Wars micro-series already did that anyway. No, the Clone Wars doesn't show us how the Anakin we see in Revenge of the Sith came to be. It shows us how he became Darth Vader. However, this doesn't take the form of a character arc. Anakin's character, like that of a lot of characters from the films who show up in the series, is mostly constant. Rather, the Clone Wars exposes the darkness that was already present within Anakin. It's not something he develops over the course of the series, just something that is becoming less capable of hiding from himself. As we discussed in our long-form character analysis of Anakin Skywalker, the elements of his character that made him Darth Vader had always been present, and the only difference between Anakin and Vader was what Vader had lost. The core essence of his character remained the same all throughout. Rather than developing Anakin's character, the Clone Wars focuses on getting the audience to understand his arc in the prequels. It clarifies the character of Anakin Skywalker, and it does so by getting us to like him. For a lot of viewers, that's something the prequels failed at doing. Many found Anakin unlikable, especially in Attack of the Clones. The Clone Wars avoids that. Its depiction of Anakin is likable to a fault, even when he's doing questionable things. In the Clone Wars, you see Anakin as Obi-Wan, Ahsoka, or Padme would have seen him. Sure, he's reckless, arrogant, and sometimes can be a little bit brutal, but for the most part, he's a deeply caring mentor, a brilliant strategist and warrior alike, a loving husband, and a good friend. In the Clone Wars, we like Anakin Skywalker, and yet, now and again, the cracks in him show. They show in Brain Invaders, when he force chokes Poggle the Lesser during an interrogation. They show in Season 4's Zygerian arc, in his open hatred for the Zygerian slavers. They show during his encounters with Rush Clovis, in which Anakin acts the part of the abusive, possessive partner out of jealousy of Clovis's love for Padme. And they show after Obi-Wan fakes his death in Season 4, through the downright Vader-like way Anakin starts acting toward the people who get in his way. The Clone Wars shows us the uncomfortable truth of Anakin Skywalker's character, that he was Darth Vader all along. At the same time, we're also shown how the pressures of war accentuate the darker aspects of Anakin's character. Amidst the chaos and bloodshed of the Clone Wars, the people around Anakin don't see it when his dark side begins to show. The conflict gives Anakin a sort of outlet for violence, and it makes him more prone to it. Thus, his butchering of the Zygerians in the episode Escape from Kadavo, for instance, which otherwise would have been a clear warning sign, blends into the background as just more acts of war. War is a tool of the dark side after all, and the Clone Wars feed the growing dark side in Anakin's heart. Because the Clone Wars ramps up the anxieties that the Revenge of the Sith novelization tells us were the source of Anakin's dark side, his fear of losing others. To quote the novelization directly, the HoloNet features call him the hero with no fear. And why not? What should he be afraid of? Except fear lives inside him anyway, chewing away the firewalls around his heart. Anakin sometimes thinks of the dread that eats at his heart like a dragon. Children on Tatooine tell each other of the dragons that live inside the suns. Smaller cousins of the sun dragons are supposed to live inside the fusion furnaces that power everything from starships to pod races. But Anakin's fear is another kind of dragon, a cold kind, a dead kind. Not long after he became Obi-Wan's Padawan, all those years ago, a minor mission had brought them to a dead system, one so immeasurably old that its star had long ago turned to a frigid dwarf of hyper-compacted trace metals. Anakin couldn't even remember what the mission might have been, but he'd never forgotten that dead star. It had scared him. Stars can die? It is the way of the universe, which is another manner of saying that it is the will of the Force, Obi-Wan had told him. Everything dies in time, even stars burn out. This is why Jedi form no attachments. All things pass. That is the kind of fear that lives inside Anakin Skywalker, the dragon of that dead star. It is an ancient, cold, dead voice within his heart that whispers, all things die. The dragon whispers of what Anakin has lost and what he will lose. The dragon reminds him every night of how he held his dying mother in his arms, of how she had spent her last strength to say, I knew you would come for me, Anakin. The dragon reminds him every night that someday he will lose Obi-Wan, he will lose Padme, or they will lose him. All things die, Anakin Skywalker, even stars burn out. In the Season 4 episode, Deception, Anakin comes face to face with his greatest fear when, seemingly, Obi-Wan is killed by the bounty hunter Reiko Hardeen, and it messes him up badly. Throughout the episode, Anakin is in the grip of the dark side, consumed by grief and haunted by his inability to save Obi-Wan. His desire for revenge against Hardeen becomes such an issue that the Jedi Council ultimately has to tell Anakin that Obi-Wan isn't really dead and that the whole thing was part of a wider intelligence gathering plot. This eventually calms Anakin down, but the experience leaves a lasting scar. It's a traumatic reminder that, one day, he will lose Obi-Wan for real. Anakin Skywalker confronts his greatest fear in this arc, and he loses badly. Even if Obi-Wan didn't really die, the experience is real for Anakin, and it causes him to lose himself. He breaks down completely, spiraling out of control and slipping into the dark side's embrace. And the influence of the dark side doesn't go away once Anakin learns the truth either. Anakin remains in a grim mood throughout the arc, and the dark side resurfaces in him during his duel with Dooku on Naboo in the arc's final episode. Even though Anakin knows by that point he hasn't actually lost Obi-Wan, he's still keenly aware of just how easily he really could have. As a result, when he's at risk of losing Palpatine to Dooku at the arc's end, he lashes out because he doesn't want to experience the same pain a second time. Not only does Anakin lose his battle with his fear in this arc, but his experiences make that fear stronger. And the circumstances of the Clone Wars as a whole are a contributing factor to this. Anakin and most of the people he cares about are risking their lives for most of the show, and while the Clone Wars doesn't touch on the impact that has on Anakin directly, it's evident from the Reiko Hardeen arc that it would be constantly making his fear worse. Over the course of Star Wars The Clone Wars, the Dead Star Dragon in Anakin's heart grows stronger and stronger, feeding on every close call his loved ones have. And the stronger it grows, the more Anakin resorts to the dark side. We see this in the Reiko Hardeen arc, but we also see it in Brain Invaders when his treatment of Poggle is driven by fear over losing Ahsoka, and we see it in his treatment of Clovis, whom Anakin is afraid he'll lose Padme to. The Clone Wars wear Anakin Skywalker down, crisis by crisis, and as they do, the dark side waxes within his heart. This, of course, has consequences not just for Anakin, but for the galaxy and for the Force itself. This is shown quite clearly in one of Star Wars The Clone Wars' most misunderstood story arcs, the Mortis arc from Season 3, which sees Anakin, Obi-Wan, and Ahsoka brought to another plane of existence, the realm of Mortis, by 3 powerful Force wielders. This puts in motion a series of events that sees all 3 Force wielders slain before Anakin and company are returned to their normal plane of existence. The Mortis arc plays an interesting role in the grander narrative of Star Wars The Clone Wars. It contextualizes the Clone Wars and the events that follow in the life of Anakin Skywalker, showing us their place in the broader, millennia-long conflict between the light and dark sides of the Force. It shows the impact of the Clone Wars on the fabric of the Force itself, and it does so by showing the audience an allegory for the events of the Star Wars saga. As we've said before, the Mortis arc is perhaps the most misunderstood arc in Star Wars The Clone Wars. Even some later Star Wars sourcebooks that reference the arc have gotten its meaning wrong. The Mortis arc centers around 3 Force wielders, the daughter, the son, and the father, each of whom embodies certain aspects of the Force. The daughter is clearly aligned with the light side. She's selfless, noble, compassionate, and aloof. The son, to contrast, is much darker. He's ambitious, scheming, and wants to seize power for himself. The father is driven by a desire to establish balance between the two, a role he believes he's getting too old for, hence his interest in the Chosen One prophecy, which he believes means Anakin will take over for him. The simple understanding of these 3 beings is that the daughter represents the light side, the son represents the dark side, and the father represents balance between the two. But as we've discussed in the past, that isn't exactly the case. If this wasn't already evident in the fact that there can be no balance between the light side and the dark side, and that balance in the Force means the triumph of the light and the destruction of the dark, a closer examination of the plot of the Mortis episode clarifies this issue. The daughter and the son aren't so much embodiments of the light and dark than they are embodiments of parts of humanity that feed the light and the dark. They represent the lowercase l light side and the lowercase d dark side, the lighter and darker aspects of humanity that exist within everyone. The distinction is subtle, but it's important. The daughter is selflessness, charity, and compassion for living things, while the son is selfishness, ambition, and hunger for power. Because of this, the daughter is naturally drawn to the light side, while the son is naturally drawn to the dark side. But they aren't one and the same with their respective allegiances. The father, meanwhile, represents the Jedi. He is aligned with the will of the Force, and his aim is to maintain the neutral balance of life, balance between the aspects of humanity embodied by his children. He seeks to maintain the balance of the Force, which means that he is aligned with the light side, the Force as it is meant to be. He has fulfilled this duty for untold millennia, but now he's getting old, and his ability to maintain the balance is fading. His time, like the time of the Jedi Order, is almost at its end. The daughter, who's drawn to the light side, supports the father, which is why she always acts in accordance with what she believes the father wants throughout the arc. She sometimes acts with greater urgency than the father considers necessary, but this is more a matter of her being overzealous than in conflict with the father. Their goals are still aligned, and the daughter just gets a bit hasty sometimes. It's the son, who's drawn to the dark side, that upsets the balance of Mortis in his desire for power. The son's character's journey in the Mortis arc acts as a metaphor for the path to the dark side. In the first episode of the arc, the son isn't all that malicious, just curious about that which is forbidden to him. It's only in the second episode, as his ambitions and lust for power grow, that the dark side begins to consume him, turning him against the father and eventually against the daughter as well. It can be assumed that the son has strayed toward the dark side in the past, in light of his battles with the daughter, but previously he'd been kept in check by the father. Now, though, in the midst of the Clone Wars, the father is too weak to keep him in line any longer, and the power the son believes he could gain by controlling the Chosen One is a temptation too strong for him to ignore. But even as he plots to control Skywalker and seize power on Mortis, the son isn't fully gone. He's turned against the father, whom he tries to kill with the dagger of Mortis at the end of the second episode, but he still cares about the daughter, his sister, in spite of their ceaseless battles. This is shown quite clearly in how, when the daughter sacrifices herself to save the father's life, taking the killing blow the son had meant for the father, the son is horrified. He becomes maddened with grief and he flies off to the well of the dark side, where the dark side is most concentrated on Mortis, which is notably a separate location from the castle where he lives. This is when the son falls to the dark side. His murder of the daughter is a clear mirror of the Sith initiation ritual, in which a prospective Sith would be made to murder the person they were emotionally closest to. This ritual was an act of dedication to the dark side, a way of severing one's emotional grounding in the universe, leaving them with nothing to care about but power. The son does this by accident, much like Anakin Skywalker did when he caused the death of Padme, but it has the same effect. With the daughter dead, the son has nothing left but his ambition, and only then is he lost to the dark side. In the son's case, the meaning of this is literal. The daughter embodies all that the Sith tried to purge from themselves in this initiation ritual, and in killing her, the son kills those things in himself. A scene at the start of the third episode of the arc was supposed to make this clearer, depicting the son mourning the daughter's death and revealing that he had been manipulated and drawn to the dark side by the ghosts of the ancient Sith, but it was cut because it presented Sith Lords as genuine Force ghosts, which is supposed to be impossible. Once the son had been consumed by the dark side in the third episode, the father recognizes him as a threat to the balance of the Force that must be destroyed, and for the son to be destroyed, he needs Anakin Skywalker, the Chosen One. Anakin's role in all of this is interesting. The ones, or at least the father and the son, have differing views of what his role as the Chosen One means, but all of them see Anakin as a tool in their respective agendas. The father believes that Anakin's duty is to replace him, to just step into his place and continue to maintain Mortis as he had maintained it for eons, while the son sees Anakin as a key to greater power, someone he can control in order to get what he wants. Both perspectives represent how different players in the prequels see Anakin. The father's understanding of the Chosen One prophecy mirrors the way the Jedi Council understands it. The Jedi see Anakin's role in stopping the dark side as simple and a little different from how they had been fighting the dark side for millennia, unable to see that their way was no longer sufficient to stop the dark side, much as the father had become unable to control the son. The son's approach to Anakin, meanwhile, mirrors Darth Sidious's. Sidious, like the Son, sees Anakin as a stepping stone to ultimate power, a weapon to be used against the Jedi and nothing more. Both of these perspectives deny Anakin agency, and as a result, both of these perspectives are ultimately wrong, as shown at the end of the Mortis arc. Sidious and the Son, of course, are wrong that Anakin can ever be a mere tool of the dark side, but the Father and the Jedi are wrong in believing that he simply represents a continuation of their long war against the dark side. Anakin represents the end of the war against the dark side. His job is to slay the Son, to destroy the Sith, to bring balance to the Force once and for all, and to revitalize the way of the light in the process. The Jedi, much like the Father, had grown incapable of holding back the tide of the dark side, and as a result, their destruction was near at hand. The death of the Father at the end of the Mortis arc represents the death of the old ways of the Jedi, not the death of the light altogether, but a change in the times, following which the Jedi could eventually rise again, renewed. The events of the Mortis arc act as an allegory for the entire Star Wars saga, making clear the role that Anakin Skywalker is really meant to play. Mortis itself is a metaphor for the age-old conflict between the light and the dark, the stage on which the tale of the Jedi and the Sith is set. That's why it disappears at the end of the arc. When the prophecy of the Chosen One is fulfilled, the war is over and the conflict has ceased to exist. Consequently, Mortis also shows us the way the Clone Wars fit into the history of the Force. The Clone Wars are the latest of the many wars between the light and the dark, the Jedi and the Sith, with the Sith using both sides of the conflict to wage a shadow war against the Jedi. Unlike in previous Sith wars, the Jedi are incapable of stopping the Sith this time. Their Order's time is at an end and their tactics have ceased to be effective. They don't even understand the true nature of the war, as we'll discuss later, and the way the dark side has been manipulating them to its own ends. They need the Chosen One to stop the dark side, but they fail to understand Skywalker's role in things, and as a result, the Jedi Order is destroyed and the war is lost. But through Skywalker, the dark side is eventually defeated and balance is restored. Of course, that doesn't all happen in the time of the Clone Wars. While the Clone Wars is a battle between the dark side and the light, the sides aren't what the Jedi think they are. Both sides, and indeed the war itself, are tools of the dark side, used by the Sith to crush the light between them. The Jedi may be right in seeing the conflict as a matter of the Force, but they don't have the full picture, and as a result, they damn themselves. The Clone Wars end up being only the first part of the battle against Darth Sidious, and the ultimate victory of the light, the return of balance to the Force, has to wait until the Battle of Endor. Throughout its run, the Clone Wars gave us a detailed look at the relationship between the Jedi Order and the war they were fighting, both from individual and larger scale perspectives. In a sense, these story threads could be looked at as part of an autopsy of the Jedi Order, examining the factors that led to its demise and its context in the broader world of the Force. But the Clone Wars isn't just about the Jedi. After all, the Jedi weren't the only ones fighting for the Republic in the Clone Wars. Most of that work was done by the clone troopers under their command. And unlike many other Clone Wars era stories, the Clone Wars puts a lot of focus on the clones and their own unique struggles. At this point, the Clone Wars is well known for its diverse cast of clone characters, through whom the audience gets a glimpse into the lives and conditions of the Republic's grunts. While the clones are little more than props in the films, the Clone Wars makes them genuine characters, each unique despite being physically identical. And these clone characters regularly have their own subplots and storylines, even in episodes that are mostly part of other story threads, such as Ambush and Innocence of Ryloth from Season 1. Ambush really sets the stage for how the series as a whole handles the clones. This episode features 3 clone characters, Lieutenant Thaya and Troopers Jek and Reese. 2 of the 3 are new characters created for the episode, and most Star Wars fans probably don't even know that Thaya was a character with prior appearances in the extended universe and Revenge of the Sith, so they're all effectively blank slates. but the Clone Wars immediately makes them all stand out, giving them each a few defining traits for the audience to remember. They're far from the most complex characters, but the show gives you just enough to be able to differentiate them and see them as individuals, which is the point. The episode even has the clones remove their helmets so that Yoda can give each of them personalized advice at one point. None of the 3 clone characters in Ambush are all that deep, and none of them appear again in the series, but they leave a lasting impact, because the episode provides them with just enough personality for the audience to understand that these are people with unique and complex identities. The episode uses these 3 clones to reshape how the audience thinks about the clones in general. They may look the same, but each of them is different, and they're as worthy of consideration and characterization as the Jedi. The Clone Wars builds on this by establishing recurring clone characters, some of which have their own arcs, but it also exploits this new impression of the clones to create another effect. It gets the audience to empathize more with all clones, even the ones that aren't proper characters. The show has the audience recognize the humanity of the clones and sympathize with their struggles, giving the deaths of even the most undeveloped one-off troopers weight. This effect can be plainly seen in how a certain subset of Clone Wars fans, ourselves included, will obsess over any clone with a name or so much as a slightly different coat of paint on his armor. Sure, part of it is just the fact that clones are cool, but it also goes to show just how well the Clone Wars conditioned us to care about the boys in white. Fittingly, one of the Clone Wars' main narrative threads concerns the conditions and challenges faced by the clones. This theme is presented through 2 smaller story arcs: Captain Rex's character arc, which we did a separate long video on recently-ish, and the story of Domino Squad. These 2 arcs intertwine to form one long narrative which presents audiences with the clones' perspective of the Clone Wars. Since we've already done a full video on Rex's arc, we're going to trim those parts of this section down a little, putting the character-specific stuff aside to focus on what's relevant to the clones as a whole. Feel free to go back and watch that other video if you want a bit more on this part of the Clone Wars narrative. The Clone Wars' first real clone-centric episode is Rookies, the 5th episode of Season 1, which is regularly listed as one of the series' all-time best episodes. Rookies follows a trio of rookie clone troopers, later identified as Domino Squad, as they try to warn the Republic of an impending attack on Kamino. The 3 clones, Fives, Echo, and Heavy, receive assistance and mentorship from Captain Rex and Commander Cody, who help them alert the Republic and thwart the Separatist assault on Kamino at the cost of Heavy's life. Along the way, the episode gives us a glimpse into the lives of some of the rank-and-file clones and the challenges the Clone Wars throw at them. Our titular rookies lose their friends and have to undertake enormous risks to save their homeworld. All of this paints a clear picture of the challenges these clones face every day, and through the death of Heavy, it also shows us the cost. Heavy's sacrifice is the first real tragic clone death the show gives us, a touching moment of self-sacrifice that shows us the heart of the clones and their dedication to the mission. It's the first such death, but not the last. Rookies establishes the conditions the Clone Wars have thrust the clones into through the experiences of Domino Squad, allowing the next clone-centric episode, The Hidden Enemy, to question the justice of it all. The Hidden Enemy introduces us to an entirely new variety of clone character, a clone traitor in the form of Sergeant Slick. As we pointed out in our video on Rex, this showcases a particularly extreme form of individuality for the clones. It's one thing for them to have different personalities, after all, and another thing for clones to reject the reason they were created and choose to fight for the enemy. It challenges everything the audience thinks they know about the clones, and it challenges the clone characters in this episode too, particularly Captain Rex. Through Slick, the Clone Wars opens up a can of worms it had avoided addressing up to that point. It presents the audience with the argument that the clones aren't noble soldiers fighting in defense of the Republic, but victims of the Republic. slaves sent off to fight and die for a government under which they aren't even considered people. And while Slick is the antagonist of this episode, and Captain Rex brushes off his beliefs at first, everything he's saying is objectively correct. The clones are, legally speaking, slaves, fully owned by the Republic and afforded basically no rights. They have no stake in the Republic, and they have no choice in whether they die in its wars. By making Slick a villain, the Clone Wars avoids addressing his claims head-on. Like Ahsoka's status as a child soldier, the audience is encouraged to just kind of look past the whole thing. But Slick is only the first clone to question the status of the clones under the Republic, and as the series goes on, it begins to push his perspective more overtly. This can be seen in Season 2's The Deserter, which introduces a clone deserter, Cutler Quain, who makes pretty much the same argument as Slick, once more to Captain Rex. But while Slick is painted as a villain, Cut is never implied to be anything but a stand-up guy who cares about his family and even saves Rex's life in a battle at the end. Cut is sympathetic, and this forces both Rex and the audience to consider what he's saying. Rex, for his part, doesn't accept Cut's argument entirely. He isn't quite ready at this point in his arc, but he does choose to let Cut remain a free man instead of turning him over to the Republic, which shows that, on some level, he accepts that Cut hadn't done anything wrong. He accepts that Cut had earned his right to be free, and that's a step toward acknowledging that he and the rest of the clones weren't free. The show doesn't touch on this question directly for another 2 seasons. It leaves the audience with the Deserter's somewhat ambiguous ending, encouraging us to draw our own conclusions about the slavery of the clones. In the meantime, Season 3 brings back Domino Squad in its 2-part premiere, the episodes Clone Cadets and ARC Troopers. The first of these episodes adds some backstory to the clones we met in Rookies, who are now identified as Domino Squad, while also introducing the ARC Troopers for those who aren't familiar with the expanded universe, as well as the defective Clone 99, both of whom play a role in the subsequent episode. Clone Cadets is mostly about character development for Heavy, Fives, and Echo, getting the audience to connect with them more by showing us the struggles they faced in training. But it also gives us a bit more perspective on the lives of the clones, as it shows us the harsh lives they lived even while still growing up on Kamino. We see that everyone on Kamino but the newly arrived Jedi and one of the non-Jedi trainers is completely without sympathy for the clones. The clones have not only been subjected to the full harshness of military life from the beginning, but they've also had to endure dehumanization at the hands of their creators and trainers. Through 99, we're even shown that the Kaminoans write off some clones as altogether defective, forcing them to work as menial laborers and endure daily humiliation at the hands of their brothers. In the process, it adds a bit more to the argument presented by the hidden enemy and the deserter, showing the audience the horrors of life as a being grown to be a slave soldier. ARC Troopers, meanwhile, is another story about sacrifice. It shows us that, in spite of their treatment, the clones still see Kamino as home, and it shows them fighting ferociously in its defense, from the ARC Troopers down to 99 and the Clone Cadets. It mostly serves to reinforce the cost of war though, particularly in the deaths of several named characters, most notably 99. It shows us that no clone trooper is spared in this conflict, and it gets us to empathize further with the pain they feel as they lose everyone they've ever known on the battlefield. Unlike the death of Heavy, which was heroic and had purpose, the death of 99 is just a tragedy. Sure, 99 was a brave participant in the battle, but his death accomplished nothing. Its purpose is solely to make us feel the loss the clones suffered, this time with nothing to make us feel better about it. And the casualties continue to mount throughout Season 3. Echo, for instance, is supposedly killed in the Citadel arc, and by the time Season 4's Umbara arc rolls around, Fives is the last member of Domino Squad left, as far as the audience knows. Speaking of, the Umbara arc is perhaps the most pivotal clone-centric story arc. We won't spend too long on it, since, apart from the aforementioned Rex video, we've done a full long video on this arc specifically, analyzing pretty much every part of its narrative. The Umbara arc concerns the Battle of Umbara, primarily the 501st Legion's experiences in the battle as they're subjected to horrific mistreatment under Jedi General Krell after Anakin is recalled to Coruscant. This arc finally forces the audience to confront the injustice of the clones' existence through two particularly irritating traits of Krell's. He hates clones and routinely dehumanizes them, and he sucks at being a general. Both of these underscore the fact that the clones really are slaves. The dehumanization is the most obvious display of this, but Krell's tactics contribute too, as he regularly sends the clones on suicidal charges with no regard for their lives. Krell not only doesn't see the clones as equals, he doesn't even see them as people. They're living droids to him, made to die in a war that, by this point in the show, is seemingly increasingly pointless. The meaningless deaths many clones suffer in this arc serve not only to highlight the cruelty of Krell, but the cruelty of the war as a whole. The clones quickly start to hate Krell, and before long, the Umbara arc turns into a debate about the morality of defying orders. While Rex is on the fence about it for most of the arc, other clone characters, particularly Fives, Jesse and Hardcase, are willing to act. They start by defying Krell on small matters, but in the arc's third episode, they explicitly contradict Krell's orders by going to blow up an Umbaran missile cruiser. Despite the fact that this benefits Republic forces and only costs the life of Hardcase, Krell orders the surviving rebellious clones executed and then deliberately engineers a friendly fire incident between the 501st and the 212th. This pushes the clones over the edge, leading to an outright mutiny against Krell's leadership. In carrying out this mutiny, the clones, and particularly Rex, finally accept, to an extent, that the way the clones are treated is wrong. The blow is softened by the reveal that Krell had fallen to the dark side and turned his back on the Republic, which allows the clones to mutiny while still remaining loyal to the Republic, but the broader implications of Krell's conduct are still there, and the audience can't run from them anymore. The Umbara arc shows definitively that the renegade clones had been right, that the clones really are slaves of the Republic, dehumanized and sent off to die for nothing. The last clone-centric arc we'll discuss in this section, the opening arc of Season 6, adds one final note to this conclusion. This arc, composed of the episodes The Unknown, Conspiracy, Fugitive, and Orders, sees Fives uncover a key part of Darth Sidious's conspiracy to destroy the Jedi. After the Trooper Tup prematurely executes Order 66, Fives investigates on Kamino, discovering that the clones have chips implanted in their brains meant to force them to comply with Order 66 when the time comes. Fives even learns who's behind this plot, discovering Supreme Chancellor Palpatine's complicity in this conspiracy against the Jedi. Unfortunately, however, Fives is drugged and framed for an attempt on Palpatine's life, and he's killed before he can reveal what he's learned. While we personally detest the concept of the brain chips due to how they deny the clones agency and strip what was previously a complex and morally nuanced moment for the clones of all its meaning, they do serve a narrative purpose. They show that the clones aren't just slaves of the Republic, but pawns of the Sith, and they underscore how the clones are left with no choice in the matter. As we just said, they strip the clones of agency. This arc takes the already horrible truth of the clones' situation, as confirmed in the Umbara arc, and twists the knife by revealing that the clones have not only been forced to fight in the war, but that they'll be forced in the future to betray the Jedi. Speaking of, betrayal and loyalty are both major themes throughout the Clone Wars' clone arcs, and across the show as a whole. In fact, you could even say that loyalty is the show's main gauge of morality. Throughout the show, loyalty is characterized as the hallmark of noble characters, an admirable trait even when it leads to bad decisions. Our heroes, clones and Jedi alike, are shown to be heroic to varying degrees based primarily on their loyalty to each other. Plo Koon, for example, is shown to be one of the better Jedi by his loyalty to his men and the extent to which he values their lives. On the flip side, betrayal is the Clone Wars' ultimate sin, a mark of evil that can only rarely be washed off. The show's protagonists almost uniformly despise traitors, the clones especially, and the Clone Wars characterizes its villains by their treachery. In fact, loyalty could even be considered the main difference between the show's sympathetic antagonists and its unsympathetic ones. The sympathetic antagonists, such as Hondo, all have a sense of loyalty, while the unsympathetic antagonists, such as General Grievous, routinely scheme against and betray each other. Bad decisions that can be construed as betrayals are treated as cynical cruelty, while bad decisions made out of loyalty are usually treated with a great deal of sympathy. Loyalty is especially important to the clones, who are raised to be unfailingly loyal to each other, their Jedi generals, and the Republic as a whole. With slightly less emphasis, it's important to the Jedi too, which is why the clones respect them. And it's through loyalty that the Clone Wars keeps its audience more or less on the side of the Republic through most of its run, because even as we begin to see the injustice of the Clone Wars, we continue to see the loyalty those fighting for the Republic have for each other, and the show has conditioned us to see this as heroic. This is a particularly interesting theme for a show about the Clone Wars, given the nature of the conflict. The Clone Wars were, after all, fought between loyalists and separatists, between those who remained loyal to the Republic and those who, from a certain point of view, betrayed it. Thus, the Clone Wars' running theme of loyalty conditions viewers to be on the side of the Republic, the loyalist side, by default. The Republic's stated moral justification for the war might quickly prove to be a pack of lies, but the show gives it another moral justification, one that you might imagine many clones buying into. Sure, the Republican separatists might do some sketchy stuff, but those fighting for the Republic are the good guys because they're being loyal, while the separatists are traitors and therefore evil. This sense of morality also plays into the broader themes of the Clone Wars, particularly when it comes to the broader clone arc. What the clones value is mostly interpersonal loyalty, but they've been taught to conflate this with loyalty to authority, to the Republic, and the show calls this into question, particularly during the Umbara and Order 66 arcs. In the Umbara arc, the clones are forced into a situation where their loyalty to their brothers and their loyalty to authority come into conflict, forcing them to acknowledge that the two kinds of loyalty are separate and leading them to prioritize their loyalty to their brothers by mutinying against Krell. The same contradiction is raised in the Order 66 arc, as Five learns that the Republic has betrayed the clones and there's a conspiracy to force the clones to betray the Jedi. Loyalty to authority to the Republic will lead the clones to commit that ultimate sin they're so wary of. Loyalty ultimately complicates our protagonist's situation in the Clone Wars, that of the clones especially. Both the clones and the Jedi are being used as pawns of the Sith in the war, which will lead to terrible consequences for both of them. The clones will be made to murder their friends and mentors, and the Jedi will be made dead. Both groups were forced into their roles in the Clone Wars, and the war is detrimental to both of them. The clones are slaves of the Republic, grown to fight and die for a cause they have no stake in, while the Jedi are corrupted by the war, a war that some of them know full well will lead the Order to its doom. But members of both groups are hesitant to face it. They're unwilling to be disloyal to the Republic, not just for their own sake, but for the sake of their comrades. Loss is another major running theme in the Clone Wars, especially for the clones, and it makes the issue of loyalty all the more fraught. The clones especially lose their comrades, their brothers, left and right. The show routinely underscores the impact of battlefield death and the sense of loss it leaves on those who remain alive, which makes the series increasingly dark as it goes on, both in terms of the series' overall tone and the demeanor of its characters, many of whom grow more grim as they lose more and more friends to the war. This sense of loss makes it even harder for these characters to acknowledge the truth of their role in the Clone Wars and to turn away from it, because those fallen comrades died defending the Republic, and to turn away from it would mean they died for nothing. In this way, Star Wars: The Clone Wars deconstructs the Republic war effort, putting aspects of its injustice on full display, but keeps both its characters and the audience more or less on the Republic's side by building an emotional connection to the cause for the characters and drawing the audience into it. but as the show goes on, it continues to mount up criticism of the Republic and its war, often by leaving the front lines altogether and examining how the war affects other groups affected by the conflict, even the Separatists. In the prequel trilogy, the Separatists are fairly two-dimensional and quite clearly evil. There's nothing sympathetic about Newt Gunray or any of his fellow corporate stooges. On the contrary, the films prime us to enjoy watching them squirm. Count Dooku, while initially described as a semi-noble idealist in Attack of the Clones, is a Sith Lord with an overtly sinister agenda. He isn't sympathetic in the films themselves, and neither is General Grievous. The only part of the films that even so much as hints that there's more to the Separatist movement than these soulless warmongers is a short, easily forgettable line in the title crawl for Revenge of the Sith. The Republic is crumbling under attacks by the ruthless Sith Lord, Count Dooku. There are heroes on both sides. Evil is everywhere. Despite the assertion that there are heroes on both sides though, we never see any Separatist heroes in the film or in most Clone Wars era media. Occasionally, expanded universe stories would show sympathetic characters who are manipulated into the Separatist fold and ultimately reject the movement in the end, as is the case for the Quarren chieftain Nosor Ree in the premiere arc of the Clone Wars' 4th season. But characters who are firmly committed to the Separatist cause and are still characterized as heroes are much rarer. They're not common in the Clone Wars either, which almost always makes its Separatist antagonists overtly sinister. But there is one episode of the show that breaks that rule, fittingly titled Heroes on Both Sides. This episode sees Padme and Ahsoka travel to Raxus Secundus, the capital of the Confederacy, where the audience gets a glimpse of the real people behind the Separatist movement. Heroes on Both Sides introduces us to Mina Bonteri, a Separatist senator who, despite her firm commitment to the cause, is characterized as being noble and principled, at least as far as politicians go. Her grievances with the Republic are legitimate, and her support for the CIS is justified. She's even shown to have been personally affected by the war, having lost her husband in a battle on Argonar. She's not at all like the corporate stooges we know the CIS for. Indeed, she, and many of her fellow Separatists, are shown to dislike the corporations. This shows that not only is Bonteri a noble Separatist, but that her ideological stance isn't out of ignorance of the Confederacy's flaws. No more than loyalist characters like Padme and Ahsoka are ignorant of the Republic's flaws. In general, Heroes on Both Sides goes out of its way to show us the normal people behind the Separatist movement. Raxus Secundus isn't some sinister Sith throne world. It's an ordinary and even pleasant-looking planet inhabited by a diverse population of entirely ordinary people. The Separatist Parliament, seen for the first time in this episode, isn't some shadowy council of war profiteers, but a fairly ordinary legislature. Hell, the Parliament even seems like an improvement over the Galactic Senate. When Senator Bonteri moves to send out peace feelers to the Republic, the Parliament quickly votes in favor over the objections of the corporate representatives present. While the Senate is constantly mired in gridlock and corruption, the Separatist Parliament is seemingly much more efficient and less beholden to the power of the corporations. Of course, the manipulations of the Sith and Separatist Council render the Parliament more or less powerless, but nonetheless, it adds credence to the Separatists' assertions that the Republic is in sore need of major institutional change. While it may be the only episode of the Clone Wars to explore the Separatist side of things, Heroes on Both Sides does a fantastic job of pulling back the curtain on the CIS and showing the audience the true core of the movement. The Republic's enemies aren't sinister, expansionist warmongers, but ordinary people with legitimate grievances against an exploitative and corrupt Republic that they no longer want any part in. A Republic that's trying to reintegrate their home systems by force. The villains we see fighting for and funding the Confederacy are just opportunists taking advantage of a legitimate political movement. Heroes on Both Sides puts that simplistic, idealized narrative of the Clone Wars that we discussed at the start to bed. It shows clearly that the Separatists are not evil, no more than the Loyalists are, and as a consequence, it shows that the Clone Wars aren't some noble fight after all, but a tragedy that brings nothing but suffering to either side. The war is entirely unjustified and unnecessary, and in Heroes on Both Sides, both loyalists and separatists agree to try and bring an end to it. But peace talks are quickly curtailed due to the manipulations of the Sith and corporate factions, and the war grinds on anyway. In this, Heroes on Both Sides shows us the other side of the coin. Just as there are heroes on both sides, there are villains on both sides too. Heroes on Both Sides also introduces us to Nix Card, who, together with Senators Lot Dodd and Gumi Sam, represents the interests of the corporate factions in the Galactic Senate. While these characters are shown to have ties with the Separatists, they clearly have genuine loyalty to neither side. They're out for profit, and the war has been quite profitable for them and the powers that they represent. While Padme and Mina Bontiri are working across the battle lines in pursuit of peace, these three conspire to manipulate the Senate into keeping the war going, an effort that ultimately proves successful. This not only demonstrates the validity of one of the Separatist movement's core arguments, the massive corruption in the Senate, but it also demonstrates that the Republic isn't without its villains either. Now, you could argue that Card, Dodd, and Sam aren't good examples of villains on the Loyalist side since they have Separatist ties. But other episodes of the Clone Wars introduce Loyalist political figures who have no such leanings but are still clearly made out to be villains, namely Senator Mi Dichi of Umbara and Senator Halliburtoni of Camino. As you might guess from the fact that one of these two characters is named after real-world oil company Halliburton, which became infamous for its alleged role in starting the Iraq War, Dichi and Bertoni are also war profiteers, but wholeheartedly loyalist ones. They show no hint of dual loyalties, and they're firmly committed to a Republic victory in the Clone Wars. They're partisan to the extent that they reject any notion of peace with the Confederacy or any end to the war that doesn't involve the complete subjugation of the Separatist movement. For Bertoni especially, this is because she profits off the war, but with Dichi, that's less clear. While it's implied that he also has a financial stake in the war, he's also an ideological militarist. Between them, these two represent the vast majority of the senators at the height of the Clone Wars. Padme's peace faction is a small minority in comparison to the war profiteers and imperialists that dominate Republic government. These characters show us that not only are the actual separatists behind the Confederacy decent people with respectable opinions, but that the Republic itself is a lot more sinister than its defenders would be willing to admit. It has its own evil opportunists exploiting the situation for their own ends. Anyone watching the Clone Wars surely knows that the Republic is under the secret control of Darth Sidious, but the show's Senate-centric episodes make clear that the Republic's problems go much deeper than that. It's not just one evil mastermind or a few bad apples. The Republic is fundamentally corrupt, and the Empire is already starting to take shape within it. Like any Star Wars project worth its salt, the Clone Wars has political messaging, though for the most part, the show simply builds on the political messages of the prequel trilogy. In part, the prequels are about the death of democracy, about a republic becoming an empire, and about the slow erosion of liberty, plurality, and peace in favor of security, authority, and militarism. But the primary message of the prequels, in the words of George Lucas himself, is that democracies aren't overthrown, they're given away. While the fall of the Republic and the rise of the Empire was the result of Palpatine's scheming, the people, or at least the senators, are complicit in it. At every turn, Palpatine doesn't seize power directly, but manipulates the people into giving it to him freely. He uses the specter of the Clone Wars to get people to sacrifice their liberty until they have none left. Star Wars: The Clone Wars shows us more of this process. In particular, the Season 6 episodes, An Old Friend, Rise of Clovis, and Crisis at the Heart show us how Palpatine exploits the Clone Wars to leech away more of the Senate's power. This arc sees Palpatine exploit corruption within the intergalactic banking clan to put Rush Clovis in charge on Scipio, then manipulate him into raising interest rates on the Republic loans, while the Confederacy gets away without paying interest at all. The Sith Lords then stage first a separatist invasion of Scipio, and then a Republic counter-invasion, which sees Clovis killed and the banks thrown into chaos. In the end, the Mun government of Scipio dissolves its faction of the intergalactic banking clan and turns control of the banks over to Supreme Chancellor Palpatine. Throughout this arc, Palpatine plays the two sides of the Clone Wars off each other to erode trust in neutral institutions, paving the way for power over the galaxy's banks to be handed over to him. By blackmailing Rush Clovis into enacting policies that will favor the Separatists, Palpatine is able to lump the Scipio banks in with the Confederacy, turning the Senate against what was previously a neutral, non-partisan institution. In this, he not only erodes trust in this specific faction, but in neutral parties in general, pushing loyalists to see any neutral institution as potential separatist conspirators. He uses the fear generated by the war to galvanize the people into handing him complete control of the galactic economy, robbing the Senate of its regulatory power and the banks of their neutrality. This isn't the same as just nationalizing the banks. As shown in the arc, the Senate already had some degree of institutional control over the Scipio banks, as they had to vote on whether Rush Clovis could become the banks' new chairman. Palpatine takes this power from the Senate. In the process, he also deprives the banks of the power to work with any opponents of his soon-to-be empire, and he deprives his opponents of any means of curtailing the banks' abuses. Pursuit of Peace, which forms the second half of a two-part arc with heroes on both sides, shows us an even more overt example of this phenomenon. These two episodes, together with the second season episode's Senate Murders, follow a debate in the Senate over whether or not to increase military spending to purchase additional clones from the Kaminoans. Padme's joint peace initiative with Mina Bonteri originates as an alternative to this measure, but when the peace talks fall through, Padme and her allies continue to oppose the bill. This isn't just out of simple opposition to escalating the war. Pursuit of Peace establishes that the bill calls for the additional military funding to be raised by cutting funding for social services like infrastructure, electricity, and healthcare. We learn later in the episode that the conditions are already absolutely appalling on a lot of loyalist worlds due to similar cuts already undertaken to free up funding for the war effort. Even on relatively wealthy worlds like Naboo, people have unreliable access to running water and limited electricity. Frontier worlds are no doubt suffering far more. Pursuit of Peace, we'd argue, is one of the Clone Wars' most important episodes, and it's certainly the most important episode when looking at the show's political themes. It adds to the messages of the prequels by showing us that the death of the Republic and the rise of the Empire doesn't just cost the people of the galaxy their political liberties, but their quality of life as well. Palpatine's war isn't just spreading fear in the loyalist sectors so that the people of the galaxy will give up their power. It's causing widespread misery, impoverishing the people of the Republic, and thus depriving them of power in the process. In Pursuit of Peace, the Senate is considering giving up the most important liberty the people of the Republic have in the name of security. Because what the Senate is really debating here is whether to sacrifice the ordinary people of the galaxy on the altar of victory in the Clone Wars. In that sense, the debate is a microcosm of the whole process of the Republic becoming the Empire. In Pursuit of Peace, Padme and her allies aren't just fighting against a simple military spending increase, but against the Republic turning away from its people altogether, writing them off as expendable in the name of victory in the Clone Wars. She's fighting for democracy because that's what's at stake here. Democracies are defined by their accountability to the people, and if the Republic decides to sacrifice the people in pursuit of other goals, then it has ceased to be democratic. This, of course, is exactly what Palpatine wants. Though he ultimately has a minor role in this episode, the secret Sith Lord running the Republic casts a shadow over this whole debate, which exists to serve his agenda. He constructed this whole situation after all, and his goal is to use the fear of the war to get the Senate to do what he wants them to do. Dismantle democracy in the Republic and, through the impoverishing of trillions of Republic citizens, disempower the people of the galaxy. At the climax of the episode, Padme sums up the true nature of this debate in a speech to the Senate, which, due to its length and Disney's copyright policies, will unfortunately have to read out instead of playing a clip of. Tekla is one of my aides. Like so many of the people we tell ourselves that we're here to serve, Tekla lives in a district that rarely has electricity or running water as a result of the war. Tekla and her children can now only bathe every 2 weeks, and they have no light by which to read or study at night. The Republic has always funded these basic services, but now there are those who would divert the money to the war with no thought for what the people need to survive. If not for people like Tekla and her children, who are we fighting for? My people, your people, all our people. This war is meant to save them from suffering, not increase it. I support our brave soldiers, whether they come from the clone factories or from any of the thousands of systems loyal to the Republic. But if we continue to impoverish our people, it's not on the battlefield where Dooku will defeat us, but in our own homes. This can be considered the political thesis of Star Wars: The Clone Wars. When a nation at war ceases to fight for its people, then not only is victory no longer worthwhile, but the fight is already lost, for it has been defeated in the homes of its citizens. If the Republic is willing to sacrifice its people, then it isn't fighting for those people any longer. Its objective becomes victory for victory's sake alone, a hollow and recursive goal. In even considering this bill, the Senate has allowed the war and the fear it generates to control them, which, as we know, just plays into Palpatine's hands. All of this is made even more impactful by a brief scene earlier in the episode when Padme and Bail Organa learn from Nick's card that the Separatists have taken out new loans from the IGBC to finance millions of additional battle droids. The implication of this is subtle but critical. The Republic probably does need to fund those additional millions of clones if it wants to win the war. The military spending being considered isn't wasteful but essential to the war effort. The Senate has to make a choice between winning the war and preserving a good quality of life for its people. It can only have one or the other. And through Padme, Star Wars: The Clone Wars argues that the latter choice is the only acceptable one. If the cost of a Republic victory is the destruction of civilian life in the Republic, then that cost just isn't worth it, and it would be better to lose the war. Pursuit of Peace ends with Padme's speech receiving thunderous applause in the Senate, but this isn't the end of the debate. The episode Senate Murders, which chronologically takes place immediately after the Pursuit of Peace, sees Padme's faction in the Senate thrown into chaos after the assassination of one of its members, Anakin and War, following which the military spending bill is ultimately passed. The Senate listens to its fear instead of Padme's arguments, and it chooses war over the welfare of the people. In doing so, of course, it plays right into Palpatine's hands. As the Senate becomes increasingly undemocratic and detached from the people, distracted by the paper tiger of the Clone Wars, it's slowly converted into a tool of Supreme Chancellor Palpatine. As Palpatine already controls the Republic military, the Senate's cannibalization of the Republic to build up the war machine consolidates power in the hands of the Sith in an even more dangerous and insidious way than directly ceding power. The Senate is feeding a monster, one that ultimately becomes the backbone of Palpatine's empire, and in the process, the whole galaxy suffers. But the Clone Wars doesn't just talk about how the Clone Wars and the way the Republic handles it hangs the ordinary people of the galaxy out to dry. We get to see this happen firsthand. Many episodes of the show focus on the people caught in the crossfire of the conflict, people who have no stake in the war yet suffer because of it. Their stories let us examine the Clone Wars from yet another angle, from below, from the perspective of the ordinary people being crushed under the weight of the two warring great powers. The view of the conflict from that angle is never pretty, nor is it ever a clear-cut case of heroes versus villains. In a few cases, the Clone Wars has the suffering of civilian populations be squarely the fault of the Separatists. The Lurmen on Maridon, whose village is targeted by CIS weapons experiments in the first season, the Twi'leks that the Techno-Union use as living shields in the Battle of Ryloth, and the population of Togruta who get kidnapped and sold into slavery by the Zygerians in the 4th season are all examples of this. In these examples, these civilians are being directly victimized by the war, targeted on purpose by nefarious factions within the CIS. These examples are the minority, however, and most of the ordinary people we see suffer in the Clone Wars are victims of both sides, caught in the crossfire of the conflict. One of the first season's earlier episodes, Bomb Bad Jedi, even gives us an example in which the Republic is the one most responsible for a population getting caught in the crossfire. In that episode, we see Rhodia briefly secede from the Republic after the tides of war cut them off from vital trade routes, leading to starvation and misery on Rhodia, which forces their senator, Onaconda Farr, to beg the Trade Federation for help. This episode focuses more on Newt Gunray's vendetta against Padme and Jar Jar's efforts to help, and Gunray's antics and hostility toward Padme ultimately push Farr to reconsider his alliance with the Confederacy and rejoin the Republic, but the subtext is still there, in the background. And Rhodia is far from the only example of a planet starving through no fault of their own as a result of the war. Early in Season 3, the episodes Supply Lines and Sphere of Influence form a two-part arc dealing with this exact issue. Supply Lines is a flashback taking place just before Ambush in Season 1, while Sphere of Influence chronologically takes place in Season 3, so that these episodes are supposed to form an arc is only really apparent if you're watching in release order, which is why we recommend watching the show that way the first time around. The plots of the two episodes aren't connected, but they tell different parts of the same narrative, a story about innocent populations being starved as a result of the war. Supply Lines brings us back to Ryloth, to the early stages of the Techno-Union invasion, and deals with how the invasion of Ryloth has threatened the welfare of the Twi'lek people. The Techno-Union has established a blockade of the planet as part of its invasion plans, and while this is meant to prevent Republic forces from getting any reinforcements, it also cuts the Twi'leks off from trade, which could potentially lead to mass starvation. It's only thanks to a mercy mission launched from Toydaria that the Twi'leks ultimately live to fight another day, and even then, we see in Season 1's Ryloth arc that they still suffer greatly as a result of the invasion. Sphere of Influence, meanwhile, sees something similar happen to a planet, or rather a moon, much farther from the front lines. Pantora isn't directly caught in the crossfire of the Clone Wars, but the mass destruction and the obstruction of trade routes caused by the conflict puts it in a dire situation, which the Trade Federation exploits by blockading the planet and attempting to extort the Pantoran government. The Trade Federation exploited the situation on Ryloth in Supply Lines 2, attempting to prevent the Mercy mission to ensure a separatist victory on the planet, to make Ryloth a Trade Federation exclusive market, or both. In both cases, innocent populations starve as a result of the war, which also keeps the Republic too bogged down to intervene against the Trade Federation's abuses. All throughout the Clone Wars, the show introduces us to people who've been caught in the crossfire of the war. The third season episode, Assassin, partly deals with the refugee relief movement, which is struggling to resettle the vast numbers of people displaced by the war. In Season 7, we meet and spend a bit too much time with the Martez sisters, who were orphaned as a consequence of the war, albeit tangentially, and have to eke out a living for themselves in the lower reaches of Coruscant. And in the Season 1 episode Trespass, another of the series' best, we see that not even obscure tribal civilizations are safe from war, as the indigenous Tals of Auto-Plutonia have their way of life disturbed by trespassers from both sides of the Clone Wars, who set up shop on their homeworld without permission. The Tals are ultimately left alone, but only after fighting a brutal battle against the Grand Army of the Republic and their Pantoran allies. But the show's most prominent example of an innocent world caught in the crossfire of the Clone Wars is Mandalore. The Clone Wars' second season brought viewers to the planet Mandalore for the start of a 3-episode arc centered around the Mandalorians, which ended up being the beginning of a much longer and grander story about the planet's fate in the Clone Wars. The Mandalore we see in the Clone Wars is absolutely nothing like the Mandalore we had seen in the expanded universe up to that point. Its lush jungles have been replaced with deserts of white sand. Its simple traditional villages have become vast, domed cubist cities, and most importantly, its proud warrior culture has become a thing of the past, replaced by the pacifist new Mandalorian faction. Later expanded universe material reconciled this depiction of Mandalore with existing material, and later episodes of the Clone Wars facilitated this process, but the change was still drastic. Enough that long-time expanded universe author Karen Traviss, who had written much of the lore surrounding Mandalore, quit Star Wars writing over it. In terms of quality of life though, the Mandalore we see in the Clone Wars is much improved from what it once was. Even if the architecture all looks pretty disgusting, the city of Sundari is clearly prosperous and fairly peaceful, and the planet has clearly benefited from the new Mandalorian regime and the rejection of Mandalore's warrior past. While the Mandalore arc doesn't promote Duchess Satine's pacifism, it does establish it as being clearly preferable to the violent, warmongering ways of the Mandalorians of old. War is never good for a civilization, after all, which is a controversial message to make when talking about the Mandalorians, but it's true. Unfortunately for the Mandalorians though, the Clone Wars put this new Mandalorian society in jeopardy. This is because Mandalore is a neutral system, the capital of the Council of Neutral Systems in fact. As Duchess Satine says on several occasions, Mandalore is completely opposed to the Clone Wars and refuses to contribute to the conflict by joining either side. This is the logical choice to make, and it would have been even if Mandalore weren't pacifist. As we've discussed in depth, the Clone Wars bring nothing but harm to all involved. Unfortunately for Mandalore though, not even neutral systems are spared that harm. In fact, neutral systems end up with struggles of their own, which, on Mandalore, led to instability. We see more of this in another Season 3 two-parter, Corruption and the Academy. These episodes explore the consequences of Mandalore's neutrality in depth, as both the Republic and the Confederacy place trade restrictions on Mandalore and the other neutral worlds that, when combined with the trade disruption caused by galactic war, lead to supply shortages. Mandalore's government is forced to turn to the black market to keep its people fed, which opens the door to massive corruption. This corruption extends as deep into the Mandalorian government as Prime Minister Almec, who's revealed to be a black market ringleader, and it causes instability, further supply shortages, and even mass poisoning across Sundari. In the real world, when nations are faced with these kinds of instabilities, it often leads to the rise of reactionary groups, and Mandalore is no different. In the planet's first appearance on the Clone Wars, we're introduced to the Death Watch, a terrorist cell that wants to return Mandalore to its traditional warrior ways. Death Watch actually comes from the expanded universe, having originated as the enemies of the true Mandalorians in the Mandalorian Civil War. Back then, they were a fringe group, embracing the philosophy of might makes right and rejecting the codes for honorable conduct that the true Mandalorians tried to impose on the Mandalorian faithful, as the Death Watch believed that the Mandalorians should become crusaders again and destroy all who wouldn't submit to their rule. But while they were fringe before, even believed to be extinct, the instability brought about on Mandalore by the Clone Wars gives the Death Watch power again, and they go from being a fringe group to a major terrorist threat. They take advantage of the alienation of the Mandalorian people to urge that the only way forward for Mandalore is a return to tradition, the tradition of war and ruthless conquest. Over the course of the Mandalore arc, the Death Watch makes several big moves against the new Mandalorian government. In the Mandalore plot, they carry out bombings in Sundari and attacks on Republic military vessels, while in the next episode, Voyage of Temptation, they attack Duchess Satine's personal luxury liner with assassin droids and a separatist boarding party, attempting to kidnap the Duchess and cripple the Council of Neutral Systems. In the final episode, Duchess of Mandalore, they attempt to carry out their ultimate plan to take over Mandalore. Using doctored testimony, they plan to goad the Republic into invading the planet so they can appear to be liberators when they fight back, rallying the Mandalorian people to their cause. All of these plots fail, but that the Death Watch was even in a position to attempt them is an indication of how dire the situation is on Mandalore. Granted, the Death Watch initially had the backing of the CIS and even the Sith, but they clearly have a sizable base of support within Mandalorian culture, enough to be able to infiltrate major government institutions and recruit significant numbers of Mandalorians to fight for them. This is even though they're still just thugs at heart. Something the 4th season episode, A Friend in Need, which features the now exiled Death Watch bullying and then massacring a village of innocent people for siths and giggles, shows pretty clearly. The The Death Watch are violent hooligans LARPing as Mandalorian crusaders for a quick power trip at the expense of literally everyone around them, but the Clone Wars have given them real political power, and that threatens not only the people of Mandalorian space, but the people of other unaffiliated worlds as well. The Death Watch isn't the only dangerous group to fill a power vacuum created by the Clone Wars either. Consider the Onaka Gang, the band of Weequay pirates introduced in the Season 1 two-parter Dooku Captured and the Gungan General. These guys are played for laughs most of the time. Sure, they're pirates, but they're the semi-competent, opportunistic, usually funny kind of pirates. Nonetheless, they're still pirates, and the Clone Wars have proven to be quite a profitable opportunity for them. We see this in their first appearance, in which they manage to capture Count Dooku, Anakin Skywalker, and Obi-Wan Kenobi, whom they attempt to sell to the Republic as hostages. It's a light-hearted pair of episodes, but it shows the absurd amount of power the criminal underworld has in this time of war, and how much wealth they can extract because of it. This is addressed again in several later episodes featuring the Onaka Gang, in which the pirates are much less of a joke and much more of a real threat. In the Season 2 episode Bounty Hunters, Hondo returns to extort a bunch of Felucian farmers who have been left without protection as a result of the war and have to hire a team of bounty hunters to save them from pirate raids. Hondo and his men go from being comic relief to ruthless bullies in this episode, but they're able to do so consequence-free, since with the Jedi caught up in the Clone Wars, piracy is running rampant all over the Outer Rim. The Onaka Gang exploits this again in Season 5 when they attack a Jedi ship in the episode A Test of Strength, looking to steal lightsaber crystals. They fail in that respect, but Hondo attempts to make up for it by kidnapping Ahsoka and selling her on the Hutt slave market. Ironically, this situation is ultimately resolved by a separatist invasion of Florum, but this is less a case of the Clone Wars righting their own wrongs and more Count Dooku's incredible pettiness coming in clutch. Other criminal groups are treated with much less levity by the Clone Wars, and it's not just the Onaka Gang that's become powerful due to the war. In the episode Hostage Crisis, a small team of bounty hunters are able to storm the Senate building and force the Republic to release Zero the Hutt to them. The episode's evil plans and the hunt for Zero later reveal that these bounty hunters had the backing of the Hutt cartel, but even then, this should be something far beyond the scope of ordinary bounty hunters. Other bounty hunters later bring down a Republic warship in the episode Death Trap, and across the board, Underworld factions are shown to be extremely powerful in this period, from bounty hunters to Black Sun and the Pike Syndicate. Perhaps the most chilling example of an Underworld group getting away with murder due to the Clone Wars are the finale episodes of Season 3, Padawan Lost and Wookiee Hunt. These two episodes see a group of Trandoshan slavers kidnap Ahsoka and other Jedi Padawans and hunt them for sport on Waskar, a moon of Trandosha. Once again, this is something the Jedi are now powerless to do anything about, and the slavers are only defeated in the end because the Trandoshan's planetary neighbors, the Wookiees, caught wind of their activities and showed up to the function armed and angry. The Clone Wars haven't just created a power vacuum that Underworld factions can exploit. Anyone can get away with just about anything so long as they've got the weapons and the cruelty. That these slavers can even operate with impunity in the first place, never mind hunt Jedi for sport, is evidence of this. Needless to say, all of this is a bad thing for just about everyone in the galaxy, but it's an inevitable consequence of the Clone Wars. The opening of the Clone Wars movie even says this outright. While the Jedi are occupied fighting a war, no one is left to keep the peace. Chaos and crime spread, and the innocent become victims in a lawless galaxy. This isn't a temporary shift either. We see in the original trilogy that the criminal underworld retains the massive amounts of power it seized during the Clone Wars. The stability and security of the galaxy are both permanently eroded by the conflict, and yet again, it's the innocent who are left to suffer. The galaxy is descending into chaos, the Force is brought out of balance, and criminals aren't the only ones who can take advantage of this. As we see in Season 5, even more sinister players exploit the growing strength of the underworld to form a power base of their own. The most dangerous group that the Clone Wars gives power to is, of course, the Sith. That's the whole point of the conflict, after all. As the Jedi are consumed by war, the dark side waxes, and the days when Darth Sidious declares himself Emperor steadily approaches. The Clone Wars makes clear that the war is a Sith tool, starting with the opening film, and throughout the series, we see Sidious and Dooku ensuring that the war proceeds the way they want through careful manipulation. Occasionally, they take a direct role in this manipulation, but most of the time, they leave it to their pawns. Sometimes they use bounty hunters, as in the premiere arc of Season 2. At other times, Dooku sends out his assassin, Asajj Ventress. Ventress originated in the expanded universe before being brought into the Clone Wars, and her role is initially the same in both. She's one of Dooku's foremost dark acolytes, a Sith assassin in a similar vein to Darth Maul. Also like Maul, she's a particularly favoured pawn of her master, too favoured for her own good, as Sidious eventually suspects that Dooku plans to use her to usurp the title of Dark Lord of the Sith from him. In the episode Night Sisters, Sidious orders Ventress killed, and like Darth Maul before her, Ventress goes from being a favoured Sith assassin to yet another discarded pawn. Ventress's betrayal ultimately starts a chain of events that leads to the return of Maul himself, who the Clone Wars revealed to have survived his bisection on Naboo a decade prior. Through Ventress and Maul, we get our final unique perspective on the Clone Wars. The perspective of the abandoned pawns, those whose lives were spent in service of the Sith Grand Plan, only to have been thrown aside and denied their stake in the plan's fulfillment. These perspectives are unique because, unlike just about everyone else involved in the Clone Wars, Ventress and Maul have a much better understanding of what the true purpose of the war is. They know that Darth Sidious and Darth Tyrannus are manipulating the conflict to their own ends. Ventress knows that Dooku answers to Sidious and that the CIS is a tool in a broader Sith scheme. Maul knows that Sidious had engineered the Clone Wars as a key part of his plan to destroy the Jedi and take over the galaxy. Once, both of them were supposedly destined to reap the benefits of this scheme, but now they find themselves on the outside, just mostly ordinary people caught up in the Sith's war, and they need to find a way to survive what they know is to come. They know enough that they're unwilling to associate with either side of the war once they've been discarded, knowing to some extent that both sides are already doomed, but they have different approaches to trying to survive the fallout. At first, both follow similar paths in focusing on revenge against those they believed wronged them, in keeping with the ways of the Sith. Ventress seeks revenge against Dooku for betraying her, while Maul, knowing that Sidious is beyond his power, has to settle for revenge against Obi-Wan Kenobi, the man who supposedly robbed him of his destiny as a Sith Lord. Ventress turns to her people, the Night Sisters, for help in assassinating Dooku. Their first attempt in the episode Night Sisters proves unsuccessful. The Night Sisters' next scheme, which involves using Dooku's new apprentice, the Night Brother Savage Opress, to assassinate him, backfires spectacularly as, in the Witches of Mist, Savage turns against Ventress as well as Dooku and sets off on his own in search of Darth Maul, who is revealed to be his missing brother. After finding Maul in Season 4's Brothers and bringing him back to Mother Talzin for revitalization, Savage helps his brother attempt to get revenge on Kenobi in the Season 4 finale, which has the very creative title of Revenge. This attempt at revenge is also unsuccessful. The two former pawns take different paths after their initial attempts at revenge fail, however. Ventress recognizes the futility of revenge against Dooku, the futility of the Sith way, and she gives up on it, instead deciding to settle into life as a Night Sister on Dathomir. Those plans are dashed in the episode Massacre, which sees General Grievous wipe out the Night Sisters on Dooku's behalf, but Ventress just moves on to a new path in the next episode, Bounty, which sees her become a bounty hunter instead. Ventress remains a bounty hunter for the rest of the series, putting the skills she learned as a Sith assassin to use, making a more or less honest living. All things considered, Asajj Ventress is able to turn her life around pretty well. She's able to let go of her vendettas and escape both the Clone Wars and the attention of the Sith, and though she loses a lot along the way, she ultimately emerges better off for it all. After the slaughter on Dathomir, Dooku believes her to be dead, and Ventress successfully escapes association with the Sith. She even becomes a better person. She helps Obi-Wan escape Maul and Savage in revenge. She frees a woman who is going to be forced into marriage in Bounty, and she even helps Ahsoka in her time of need at the end of Season 5. Ventress gets out of the Clone Wars, away from the trap of the Sith in the only way she can, by walking away from it all. Maul, on the other hand, refuses to give up on exacting revenge against Obi-Wan. He's too indoctrinated into the Sith ways to see the world through any other lens. He does have other plans as well, however, driven in large part by his fear of Sidious. Even as he continues to scheme against Kenobi, beginning in the Season 5 premiere revival, Maul starts to plan for his own survival, wary of Sidious's wrath. Throughout Season 5, he begins building a power base out of elements of the criminal underworld, and while this ultimately contributes to his eventual revenge against Kenobi, this is mostly something he does for protection. Maul knows what's coming at the end of the Clone Wars, and is trying to carve out a place for himself in the galaxy so he can weather the storm. But unlike Ventress, who lies low and starts living an ordinary life to avoid attracting the Sith's attention, Maul's Sith conditioning has left him with a constant craving for power, and even though he knows to fear the wrath of Darth Sidious, he can't help but continue to dream large, to try and amass power in any way he can. He sees himself as a Sith Lord, rightfully owed all the power he can seize for himself, and unlike Ventress, he's unable to let go of that. Thus, even as he and Savage struggle to survive, they also scrabble for what power they can gather. In Revival, they attempt to usurp control of the Onaka gang, though they're ultimately unsuccessful. They have better luck in the 3-part arc, Eminence, Shades of Reason, and The Lawless, in which they ally with the Death Watch and assemble an alliance of Underworld factions. With the help of this shadow collective, Maul and Savage help the Death Watch seize control of Mandalore, following which Maul usurps control of Death Watch, killing Pre Vizsla and claiming Mandalore for his own. Taking over Mandalore provides Maul with an opportunity for revenge against Kenobi, which he takes by luring Kenobi to the planet and killing Satine right in front of him. Kenobi ultimately escapes, however, leaving Maul's revenge incomplete, and Maul is soon confronted by Darth Sidious himself, who, predictably, is unwilling to allow Maul to create a third faction in the Clone Wars. Savage is killed, Maul is captured, and the Shadow Collective weakens. The Son of Dathomir comics reveal that the Shadow Collective is eventually crushed entirely by the CIS, and Maul has to remain content with proxy rule over his slice of Mandalore. In the end, Maul loses even that. In the Clone Wars' final story arc, we see Maul relinquish what power he has left, finally left with no choice but to follow Ventress's lead and lay low. Maul, in the end, is left with no choice but to walk away. That brings us to the Clone Wars' final story arc, the Siege of Mandalore, which brings pretty much everything we've talked about so far to a head. By this point in the series, we've seen the Clone Wars from dozens of perspectives, ranging from those of the Jedi and clones fighting on the front lines, to the civilians caught in the middle, the criminals and politicians taking advantage of the chaos, and even the separatists on the other side of the battle lines. We've seen the suffering the war has inflicted on all involved, the hollowness of the loyalist fight, and how all the bloodshed has corrupted the galaxy, and all told, by the end of the 7th season, it's become abundantly clear that the simple good guys versus bad guys narrative of the Clone Wars that many viewers went into the show with is a lie. In a nice bit of symmetry, the first episode of the show's final arc, Old Friends Not Forgotten, brings us to the front lines of the Outer Rim sieges, where Anakin and Obi-Wan are fighting a battle that, in a lot of ways, mirrors the battle on Christosis the series started with. Once again, we're thrown into an epic battle between the forces of the Republic and those of the Separatists. On one side, we have our heroes, 2 brave Jedi generals and the small but fierce legion of clones they lead into battle, and on the other, we have the endless droid armies of the Separatists, which are marched into the fray like cannon fodder on the orders of a merciless super tactical droid. The battle is set on a strange alien world, and once again, despite the battle taking place in the middle of a city, there are no civilians in sight, though they do get a quick mention from Anakin this time. The Separatist armies have an advantage in numbers, but yet again, our Republic heroes are able to outwit them in the end, once more with ethically dubious false surrender tactics, winning the battle and preventing the Separatists from taking Urbana. But by this point in the series, we should know better than to take this framing at face value. We've had 7 seasons of different perspectives on the war to show us that this is not the noble fight it might have seemed to be initially. Something that became increasingly clear in the trips the show's later seasons took to the front lines. Over the course of the Clone Wars, as the show spends increasingly more time on its other storylines, our trips to the front lines of the conflict become less frequent, and what major battles we do see slowly start to change in tone. In seasons 2 and 3, they're framed less as explicitly noble and more as strategically necessary, and in season 4, we start seeing major battles where the Republic doesn't exactly have the moral high ground. The episode Darkness on Umbara tells us that one of the bloodiest battles we see in the show, the Battle of Umbara, is being fought for control of trade routes and nothing more. The clone troopers we follow in this arc are part of an invading army trying to conquer the native Umbarans' homes, and the Separatists are simply fighting in self-defense, making their resistance entirely justified. In Season 5's Onderon arc, we see the Republic covertly and illegally train and arm loyalist dissidents so they can carry out a coup against the system's separatist government, replacing the planet's separatist monarch with a loyalist one using terror tactics and rocket launchers acquired from Hondo Ohnaka. In the Battle of Scipio, Republic forces act as useful idiots for Darth Sidious, seizing control of the banks for him. We're not even given an explanation for the context behind some major battles, such as the Battle of Ringo Vinda. Urbana is a similar case. And yet, even after 3 years of the Clone Wars, we see that Anakin and Obi-Wan are still committed to the fight. Approaching the battle on Urbana little different from how they approached the Battle of Christosis. They don't see the full picture yet, and as a result, they're still loyal to the Republic. A Republic that, as the audience knows by now, has become fundamentally corrupt, supported by a Jedi Order that's already dead. Of course, the Battle of Urbana is just the start of the episode, most of which focuses on the return of Ahsoka Tano. Ahsoka isn't returning to the Jedi, or even to service in the GAR in this episode. She's just working on behalf of Bo-Katan and her faction of the Mandalorians, lobbying Kenobi and Skywalker for Republic military assistance in a forthcoming attack on Mandalore. With that said, her alliance with the Republic shows that she clearly still has some degree of faith in it and in the Jedi, and in any event, she believes that taking Mandalore is the more important issue anyway, as according to Bo-Katan's intelligence, it could lead to the capture of Darth Maul. Anakin and Obi-Wan are ultimately called away to fight in the Battle of Coruscant, which, as Ahsoka points out, is yet another example of the Republic and its Jedi generals prioritizing the Chancellor over the people of the galaxy. Just a few minutes after the Battle of Urbana brings us back to the framing with which we started the show, the audience is reminded directly that it's a lie. The Republic is fighting for its own interests here. The people of the galaxy be damned. But Anakin manages to compromise a little, giving Ahsoka half of the 501st Legion under the command of newly promoted Commander Rex to fight in the Siege of Mandalore. The Siege of Mandalore is split between the first 2 episodes of the final arc, Old Friends Not Forgotten and The Phantom Apprentice. It's another battle that, on the surface, appears to be a noble fight. It's a battle against Darth Maul, after all. Those viewers who had seen Star Wars Rebels before this arc, however, know that, in reality, this battle is just the beginning of the Imperial occupation of Mandalore, and even within the arc itself, there are indications of this. The Mandalorian civilian populace doesn't take kindly to the battle. Their concerns clearly aren't being prioritized here. The Grand Army of the Republic is again fighting as conquerors, in violation of the Republic's treaties with Mandalore, and Bo-Katan's faction is, at the end of the day, a splinter of the Death Watch, concerned more with seizing power for themselves and exacting revenge on Maul than anything else at this point. Maul himself doesn't even seem like much of a threat. All throughout this arc, he seems like he'd be perpetually on the verge of crapping himself if he still had an abdomen. He's more pathetic than anything else, openly terrified of the galactic power shift that he knows is at hand. Nonetheless, Ahsoka persists in her attempts to capture Maul through the first half of the arc, leading to a final confrontation in the Mandalorian throne room at the end of The Phantom Apprentice. While a final battle between the two factions of Mandalorian warriors rages all around them, Maul reveals his ultimate goal to Ahsoka: to stop Darth Sidious. He has sensed that Anakin Skywalker is going to become Sidious's new apprentice and herald the fall of the Jedi and the rise of the Empire, and he had intended to prevent this from happening by luring Kenobi and Skywalker to Mandalore. But Skywalker didn't come, and so he instead suggests to Ahsoka that they join forces to stop Sidious. Ahsoka refuses, and the two fight, but before they do, Maul delivers some of the most important dialogue in the show.
With your help, the Jedi can stop Sidious before it's too late.
Too late? For what? The Republic to fall? It already has, and you just can't see it. There is no justice, no law, no order, except for the one that will replace it.
This is what the Clone Wars had been showing the audience all along. It showed us the collapse of order in the galaxy, the breakdown of balance, and the rise of underworld factions. It showed us the misery of the ordinary people of the galaxy, the suffering caused by the war, and the Jedi's failure to address it. It showed us the erosion of democracy in the Republic, a republic that was willing to sacrifice its people to crush an enemy that, at the end of the day, had reasonable objections to Republic governance and every right to leave it behind. It showed us how the Clone Wars corrupted the Jedi Order, blinding them into leading an army of slave soldiers into battle on behalf of a republic that had already ceased to exist. A republic that had already become an empire. Because what else can you call a government that's willing to burn the whole galaxy down to secure its power? What else can you call a government that cannibalizes its entire civilization to conquer seceded worlds with legitimate grievances against it, putting everything second to the war effort and slowly concentrating its power behind a single dictatorial figure? The Clone Wars was never about the Republic. From the very beginning of the show, its heroes were fighting for the Empire. They just couldn't see it until it was too late. Ahsoka ultimately ignores Maul's warning, still refusing to see the true nature of the Clone Wars in its entirety. At the end of The Phantom Apprentice, she captures Maul, and the Siege of Mandalore ends with the Republic victory. In the next episode, Shattered, Ahsoka leaves with the captive Maul and her clone troopers, and they set off for Coruscant aboard the Star Destroyer Tribunal. In transit, Ahsoka senses a disturbance in the Force. At the other end of the galaxy, Anakin Skywalker has fallen to the dark side and is proclaimed Darth Vader. While she's still reeling from the realization of what's just happened, Commander Rex receives a priority message issuing an order we all knew was coming. We're going to pause here to quote one of our favorite passages from the Revenge of the Sith novelization. Order 66 is the climax of the Clone Wars, not the end. The Clone Wars will end some few hours from now when a coded signal sent by Newt Gunray from the secret Separatist bunker on Mustafar deactivates every combat droid in the galaxy at once. But the climax, it's not a thrilling climax. It's not the culmination of an epic struggle, just the opposite in fact. The Clone Wars were never an epic struggle. They were never intended to be. What's happening right now is why the Clone Wars were fought in the first place. It's their reason for existence. The Clone Wars have always been, in and of themselves, from their very inception, the revenge of the Sith. They were irresistible bait. They took place in remote locations on planets that belonged primarily to somebody else. They were fought by expendable proxies, and they were constructed as a win-win situation. The Clone Wars were the perfect trap. By fighting at all, the Jedi lost. With the Jedi Order overextended, spread thin across the galaxy, each Jedi is alone, surrounded by whatever clone troops they command. War itself pours darkness into the Force, deepening the clouds that limits Jedi perception. And the clones have no malice, no hatred, not the slightest ill intent that might give warning. They are only following orders. In this case, Order 66. Holdout blasters appear in clone hands. ARC-170s drop back onto the tails of Jedi starfighters. AT-STs swivel their guns. Turrets on hover tanks swing silently. Clones open fire, and Jedi die. All across the galaxy, all at once, Jedi die. As we said at the beginning of the video, Star Wars The Clone Wars told dozens of different stories from a dozen different perspectives over the course of its run, all of which worked together to tell a much grander story, the story of the Clone Wars. And when you look at all of the different narratives across the show, and then look at how they fit together, they convey a single message to the audience about the conflict, that it was all for nothing. Throughout the Clone Wars, when we see the suffering the war brings to the civilian population of the galaxy, our protagonists sometimes rationalize it as a necessary cost of war. A tragedy to be sure, but one that, in the long run, the Clone Wars are being fought to prevent. But the opposite is the case. That suffering is all the war really accomplished. The struggles of the clones and Jedi, all those grand battles and close calls, the suffering in the galaxy that the Jedi tolerated to focus on the war, all the lives lost on the battlefields of the Clone Wars, all of it was for nothing. Even within the show's final arc, this is apparent. The siege of Mandalore was pointless. We know that, before long, the clones will return to Mandalore as conquerors, and their reign over the planet will be no better than Maul's had been. Maul was, of course, correct about the Republic. It was already dead. Just like the Jedi Order, cannibalized into the Empire, and with the Separatists defeated and the Jedi wiped out, it's free to do what it wishes in the galaxy. The Empire, not the Republic, won the Clone Wars, and the entire galaxy lost. It was never the Separatists that were the villains in the Clone Wars, nor even the Sith. It was the war itself. The Clone Wars were the problem. They were a trap. A lie the Sith told to the galaxy, and all who fought in them lost, spreading destruction to everyone around them as they did so. Of the major characters, only Padme really recognizes this in full, but Palpatine's control of the Senate leaves her powerless to do anything about it. Perhaps the war could have been prevented before it began with enough foresight, but once it began, there was no stopping what was to come: the fall of the Republic, the death of the Jedi, and the rise of the Empire. Star Wars The Clone Wars, like Star Wars as a whole, is anti-war. More thoroughly so than most of the films are. It presents the Clone Wars as a cautionary tale about buying into the old lie of the heroic war, because even when it's necessary, war is never heroic, and such narratives often serve to mask darker truths, as they do in the Clone Wars. The show echoes the messages of the prequel trilogy about the decay of democracy and how war can be used as a tool by tyrants, but it adds a message of its own as well, that conflicts like the Clone Wars are corrupting forces in their own right, turning even the Jedi Order into a tool of the dark side, and getting wrapped up in them is always a losing battle. But the Clone Wars' message doesn't end there. Just as its final arc doesn't end with the execution of Order 66 in Shattered. Ahsoka survives Rex's initial attack, and she's even able to have his inhibitor chip surgically removed at the end of the episode. Nonetheless, Rex is one clone out of thousands on the Tribunal, and as we move into the final episode of the series, Victory and Death, the rest are still after Ahsoka's head. Ahsoka and Rex find themselves trapped in a hopeless battle against their former comrades, for even as their Star Destroyer deteriorates due to Maul's sabotage, the clones are still focused on killing Ahsoka. In the Tribunal's hangar, Rex tries one last time to reason with Jesse and his men, but he's unsuccessful. Jesse strips him of his rank, declares him a traitor to the Republic, and orders him executed along with Ahsoka. This is an interesting moment, mostly because of Rex's reaction. As we've discussed at length already, disloyalty is the ultimate sin of Star Wars The Clone Wars, especially for the clones. But Rex doesn't protest the label of traitor to the Republic. He just has a quick quip about how he didn't really care about being a commander anyway. Because he is committing treason against the Republic, and there's nothing wrong with that. The Republic wasn't worthy of the loyalty of the clones to begin with, and far from being a great sin, betraying it was the right thing to do. So Rex accepts the label of traitor, and he joins the fight against what had once been his men, to rebel against the authority of what will soon officially be the Empire. Rebellion against authority has been a major theme of Star Wars from the beginning, and it's one that the Clone Wars honors from beginning to end. But rebellion against something as large as the Empire takes proper organization, which Rex and Ahsoka alone don't have. Indeed, it had been out of the question throughout the war too. While fighting back against the Republic was ultimately the only option our heroes were left with, they would never have fared any better with the Separatists. There was no path within the scope of the Clone Wars left available for them. No path except one. This is something that we were actually told in the series' original finale at the end of Season 6 by Yoda.
No longer certain that one ever does win a war. I am. For in fighting the battles, the bloodshed, already lost we have. Yet, open to us, a path remains. That unknown to the Sith is. Through this path, victory we may yet find. Not victory in the Clone Wars, but victory for all time.
For the characters of Star Wars: The Clone Wars, there's only one way to be free of the bloodshed, the trap of the Sith, and that's by walking away and refusing to participate any longer. There's no winning this fight, and so the only way to save the future, to defeat the Sith and the scourge of the dark side, is to withdraw. Either to fight another day when the tides have shifted, or to train the next generation to undo the damage that has been done to the galaxy. Other characters had walked away from the war previously, albeit without understanding the full lesson. Cutler Quain did so when he deserted. Asajj Ventress did so when she gave up on her revenge on Dooku, and Ahsoka did so when she turned away from the Jedi. At the end of Victory and Death, she and Rex chose to make that choice again, albeit with a fuller understanding of its significance, as, in the films, do Obi-Wan and Yoda. As the power of the dark side waxes and the Empire declares itself officially, they each go into exile to varying degrees. But the last chapter of the Revenge of the Sith novelization says, "Even in the deepest night, there are some who dream of dawn." Star Wars: The Clone Wars aims to help its audience truly understand the events of the prequel trilogy, The Clone Wars, and the circumstances around it. It shows us the grim reality of war, the sinister mechanisms of the Empire, and it shows us the only way to escape them, by rejecting them entirely. The Clone Wars means a lot to us, and we bet it means a lot to many of you as well. Thank you for joining us on this retrospective analysis, and as always, we'd like to hear your thoughts. What lessons did Star Wars: The Clone Wars teach you? What do you think its most important message is? Feel free to post your thoughts in the comment section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and we hope to see you in the next one.